Welcome back to Sleep Theories, and welcome back to the dark. Get comfortable. Let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders and settle somewhere far away from here. Dim the lights if they are still on, pull the blanket up, let your breathing slow down until it becomes the quietest sound in the room. Tonight's story comes to us from SGS Charles, who suggested this topic. If you have a story you would like to hear, whispered into the dark some night, leave it in the comments, because that is exactly how tonight's episode was born. Now, let us begin. There is a book that has never gone out of print in nearly 500 years. It has outlived kingdoms. It has outlived empires. It has survived fires, wars, revolutions, censorship, and the slow indifference of time that erases almost everything else. It has been printed in dozens of languages, smuggled across borders, banned by churches, mocked by scholars, and quietly consulted by people who would never admit it out loud. The book contains almost 1,000 short poems, 4 lines each, no longer than a breath. They are written in a strange tangle of old French, Latin, Greek, and words that do not appear in any dictionary at all. They mention cities that no longer exist. They mention animals behaving in impossible ways. They mention fire falling from the sky, and iron birds and men who wear masks of glass. And for 5 centuries, every single time something terrible has happened in the world, someone somewhere has opened that book, turned to a page, and said the same 3 words. He predicted this. The book is called Les Prophecies. The man who wrote it was named Michel de Nostradamus. History calls him Nostradamus. Tonight we're going to walk very slowly through his life. Through the plague-choked streets he treated patients in, through the candlelit attic where he wrote by night, through the funeral in the summer of 1566, and into a room in southern France where a sealed envelope disappeared and was never mentioned again. And then, once we know the real history, we're going to step through a door into something else. Into a story about a hidden order of quatrains, a missing verse, an archive that has existed since the reign of a sun king, and a group of quiet people who believe the most dangerous thing about a prophecy is not whether it is true, it is what people do once they believe it. Before we go any further, let me be honest with you, the way I always am on this channel. What follows is a conspiracy story, a piece of fiction built on a foundation of real history. The dates are real. The places are real. Michel de Nostradamus was real, and much of what you're about to hear about his life is drawn from the historical record. But there is no evidence that his verses were ever secretly decoded. There is no hidden archive. There is no missing quatrain locked beneath an observatory in Provence. Scholars who have studied these verses professionally will tell you, patiently and repeatedly, that they are vague enough to fit almost anything, and that this vagueness is the entire trick. So treat this as what it is, a story to fall asleep to, a beautiful, unsettling, entirely fictional what-if. Now let the room get darker. Let us go back to the year 1503, Salon-de-Provence, a small town in the south of France, the kind of place where the stone holds the heat of the day long after the sun has gone down, where the streets smell of dust and lavender and animals, where the roofs are the colour of old clay. On the 14th of December, a boy is born into a family of grain dealers and notaries. His grandparents had converted from Judaism to Catholicism some years earlier, a decision made under pressure, in a country where being what you were born as had become dangerous. The boy is named Michel. He is bright in a way that unsettles the adults around him. He learns quickly. He asks the kind of questions that make grown men change the subject. His grandfather, according to the stories that survive, teaches him the old sciences, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, mathematics, and astrology, which in the 1500s is not a superstition on the edge of respectable thought, but a legitimate branch of medicine, taught in universities, practiced by physicians who believed the movement of the planets shaped the health of the body. Picture him as a child, small, dark-eyed, standing in a courtyard at night with an old man beside him, both of them looking up at a sky that has no electric light anywhere in it, not a single bulb burning anywhere on Earth. The stars in 1510 were not the faint smudge we see now. They were an overwhelming, crowded silver riot from horizon to horizon, close enough to feel like weather. That is the sky he learns to read. At 14 he is sent to Avignon to study, and then, in the summer of 1519, the plague arrives. The university closes. Michel goes out into the countryside instead of hiding from it, and for the next 8 years he wanders. This period of his life is poorly documented, which means it belongs partly to history and partly to legend. What we know is that he worked as an apothecary. He collected remedies. He learned which herbs did something and which ones only comforted. He walked from town to town in a country where the roads were mud, and the inns had fleas, and the sick were often simply locked inside their houses and left. He saw the plague up close, over and over. In 1529 he enrolls at the University of Montpellier to become a doctor. The story goes that he was expelled, or nearly so, when the faculty discovered he had worked as an apothecary, a trade considered beneath a physician. The registry of the university still carries a note in the margin of his name. Whatever happened, he leaves, and he keeps practicing anyway. He becomes known across the south of France as a plague doctor, not the beaked mask figure of the later centuries. That image comes decades after him. But a man who walked into infected houses when other physicians would not. His methods were unusual for the time. He refused bloodletting, which was the standard treatment and which almost certainly killed more patients than it saved. He insisted on clean water, on fresh air, on removing the dead quickly, on changing bedding. He made rose pills, small lozenges of powdered rose petals and cloves and other ingredients, and he had patients keep them under the tongue. There is no evidence they cured anything, but the rest of it, the cleanliness, the ventilation, the refusal to open a sick person's veins, was accidentally, quietly, centuries ahead of its time. He married, he had 2 children, and then the plague came to his own town. He was away, treating others, when it reached his household. He came back to find his wife dead, his son dead, his daughter dead. The man who had saved strangers across half of Provence could not save the 3 people who mattered most. Sit with that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because everything that comes after, every strange verse, every midnight vigil, every cryptic line about fire and blood and falling towers, comes from a man who had already watched the world take everything from him once, and had no reason to believe it would not do so again. His wife's family sued him for the return of her dowry. His reputation collapsed. Patients stopped calling. And then the Inquisition took an interest in an offhand remark he had supposedly made about a bronze statue of the Virgin, something about it looking like a demon, which he claimed had only been a comment about the quality of the casting. He was summoned to answer for it in Toulouse. He did not go. Instead, Michel de Nostradamus disappeared for 6 years. He went east. Italy, probably. Perhaps Sicily. Perhaps further. The record thins out to almost nothing. He is a man walking away from a ruined life with no destination, through a Europe convulsing with religious violence, and when he emerges again on the far side of those 6 years, he is different. He has begun writing. By 1547 he has returned to Provence, and settled in a town called Salon-de-Provence, in a narrow house on a narrow street. He marries again, to a wealthy widow named Anne Ponsard. He has 6 more children. He becomes, by the standards of the time, comfortable, and every night he climbs the stairs. The upper floor of his house becomes his study. He works there alone, by candlelight, sometimes until dawn. He has instruments. He has star charts. He has a brass bowl of water that he sets on a tripod, according to his own descriptions, and stares into until the surface stops moving and something happens behind his eyes. He describes the process himself, obliquely, in the first 2 verses of his own book. Sitting alone at night, a slender flame, a voice that makes him tremble, divine splendour. He tells the reader almost nothing. Useful, and yet somehow the image lands with terrible clarity. A middle-aged man in a cold room above a sleeping town, staring into a bowl of water at 3 a.m, writing down whatever arrives. In 1550 he publishes his first almanac. Weather predictions, agricultural advice, astrological forecasts for the year. It sells. He publishes another, and another. They sell so well that he keeps producing them annually for the rest of his life, and they make him genuinely famous across France. But the almanacs are not what we remember. In 1555 in Lyon, the printer Mace Bonhomme produces the first edition of a book with an unwieldy title that gets shortened almost immediately to 2 words: Les Prophecies. It contains 353 quatrains, arranged into groups he calls centuries. Not centuries of time, centuries in the old sense, meaning groups of 100. He intends there to be 10 of them, 1,000 verses in total. He never quite finishes. The 7th century is incomplete. Some verses appear in some editions and vanish from others. The whole thing has the texture of something assembled hurriedly and revised in secret. And the verses themselves are like nothing else in European literature. They are not narrative. They do not follow one another. Each one is a fragment, a shard, an image without a frame, a city burning, a great man falling, a river running red, a young lion overcoming an old one in single combat, blood spilled in a golden cage. There are no dates in almost any of them. There are almost no names, and the ones that appear are ambiguous or archaic or possibly anagrams. The grammar breaks, word order inverts. He drops Latin roots into French sentences and Greek constructions into Latin phrases, and invents words that appear nowhere else. Scholars have spent 5 centuries arguing about whether this obscurity was deliberate. The conventional answer is yes, but for a very practical reason. France in the 1500s was a country where you could be burned alive for the wrong opinion. Predicting the death of a king was, specifically and explicitly, a capital offence. If Nostradamus wanted to write about the collapse of thrones and the deaths of monarchs and the burning of cities, and he wanted to keep his own skin, he had to write in a way that could always be denied. Ambiguity was armour. But there is a second, quieter theory, and this is where our story begins to lean. What if the obscurity was not only armour? What if it was a lock? Because here is the thing about Les Prophecies that even sceptical historians will grant you. The verses are not arranged in any order that makes sense. They are not chronological. They are not thematic. They are not alphabetical or geographical or grouped by subject matter. A verse about a naval battle sits beside a verse about a plague, sits beside a verse about a cardinal, sits beside a verse about a comet. Century 2 and Century 8 cover the same ground. Nothing builds, nothing resolves. For a man who was, by every account, methodical, mathematically trained and obsessive about detail, the arrangement of his masterwork looks like it was thrown down a staircase. Historians have generally shrugged at this. Manuscripts got jumbled. Printers made errors. He wrote them over years and never organised them. But there has always been another possibility, hovering at the edge of the scholarship, never quite respectable enough to say out loud. What if they were shuffled on purpose? What if the disorder is the encryption? Hold that thought. Let it sit in the back of your mind like a stone in a pocket. Because in 1559, something happened that turned Nostradamus from a curiosity into a legend, and it is the single most important event in the history of his reputation. King Henry II of France, a strong and vigorous man in his early 40s, held a tournament in Paris to celebrate a pair of royal marriages. On the last day, against the advice of everyone around him, he insisted on riding a third joust against a young captain of his Scottish Guard named Gabriel de Montgomery. The lances met. Montgomery shattered. A splinter of wood went through the king's golden visor. It entered above his right eye, drove through, and lodged behind. He stayed upright in the saddle for a moment. Then he began to fall. The finest surgeons in Europe were summoned. Andreas Vesalius himself came. They practised on the heads of executed criminals, driving splinters into the same place, trying to understand what they were dealing with. It made no difference. For 10 days the king lay in a room in Paris while infection worked its way through his skull, and on the 10th of July 1559 he died. And someone opened a copy of Les Prophecies, published 4 years earlier, and found a verse about a young lion overcoming an old one on a field of battle, in single combat. 2 wounds made into one, eyes pierced through a cage of gold, then a cruel death. Read it in isolation, and it is uncanny. The old lion, the golden cage which people took immediately to mean the gilded visor, the eye, the cruel death. Read it as a scholar, and there are problems. Henry was not old, and Montgomery was not so much younger. The heraldic lion was not Henry's personal emblem. The verse mentions a field of combat and a war, and this was a celebration. The phrase about 2 wounds becoming one has never been satisfactorily matched to anything. It does not matter. The Queen, Catherine de' Medici, believed it. And Catherine de' Medici was, at that moment, about to become the most powerful person in France. She summoned Nostradamus to court. She made him a royal counsellor. She had him cast horoscopes for her sons. In 1564, she and the young King Charles IX travelled across France on a royal progress, and they made a point of stopping at Salon-de-Provence to visit an aging physician in a narrow house on a narrow street. The king named him counsellor and physician in ordinary. Think about what that means. A man who had been chased out of Toulouse by the Inquisition, who had lost his family and his practice and his name, was now, in his 60s, receiving the King of France in his own front room. There is a story from that visit that historians repeat because it is too good not to. Nostradamus supposedly asked to see the birthmarks of a young boy in the royal household, a boy named Henry of Navarre. Having examined him, he said to have declared that the child would one day be King of France. 30 years later, Henri of Navarre became Henry IV. Whether that story is true is anyone's guess. It first appears in print long after everyone involved was dead. But it is the kind of story that attaches itself to a man like a burr, and it never came off. He was, by then, very ill. He suffered from gout and from what the sources call dropsy, a swelling of the body that we would now recognise as heart failure. His legs filled with fluid. His breathing became laboured. He could not climb the stairs to his study without stopping. On the 1st of July, 1566, he called for a lawyer and finished his will. He was meticulous about it. He listed his possessions down to the individual coins in a locked box, 3,444 crowns, counted precisely. That night, his assistant, a young man named Jean M. de Chavigny, prepared to leave the house for the evening. According to Chavigny's own account, written years later, Nostradamus said something to him as he went, that he would not find him alive at sunrise. In the morning they found him on the floor beside his bed, between the bed and a bench, exactly as he was said to have described in one of his own almanac verses. He was 62 years old. They buried him upright in a wall of the Franciscan chapel in Salon-de-Provence, standing sealed into the stone, because he had reportedly requested that no one be able to walk over his grave, and that is where the history ends and the story begins. Salon-de-Provence, July 1566, 2 days after the funeral. The house is quiet in the way houses are quiet after a death, which is not the same as ordinary quiet. It is a listening kind of silence. Doors have been left half open. Nobody has decided yet who is allowed to touch what. Jean M. de Chavigny climbs the stairs to the study. He has been in this room 1,000 times, but never alone in it, and never with permission to open anything. The shutters are closed against the July heat. The air smells of candle wax and dust and dried herbs, and underneath that, faintly, the mineral smell of old ink. He opens the shutters. Light falls across the table in a hard white bar, and there it all is, a lifetime of paper. He begins to sort. It is slow work. There are astronomical tables, columns of figures in a cramped, urgent hand. There are ephemerides, the printed almanacs of planetary positions, annotated in the margins so heavily that the printed text has almost disappeared under the writing. There are medical notes, recipes for the rose pills, a list of patients with small crosses beside some of the names. There are unfinished quatrains, dozens of them, lines crossed out and rewritten, sometimes 4 or 5 times, the words getting shorter and stranger with each revision, as though he had been sanding them down, removing every handle a reader might grip. Chavigny works through the afternoon, and then, beneath a folder of blank paper at the bottom of a locked drawer, he finds an envelope. It is heavy, thicker than a letter. The wax seal is unbroken and unmarked. No crest, no initial, just a smooth black disc the size of a coin. Across the front, in his master's handwriting, are 6 words. Destroy this before they arrive. Chavigny sits down. He would write about this moment much later, in a passage that scholars have always dismissed as invention, a bit of drama added to make his memoir of the great man more marketable. He describes the weight of the envelope in his hand. He describes reading those 6 words 3 times, and each time understanding them less, before they arrive. Not if, not should, before. As though the man who wrote it had known there was a schedule. He's still holding it when he hears the horses. They come up the narrow street at a walk, which is somehow worse than a gallop, because a gallop means panic, and a walk means certainty. He goes to the window. 4 men, 2 in the livery of the royal household, 2 in nothing identifiable at all. They do not knock. The rest of the account is brief and strangely flat, the way people write when they have decided not to remember something too clearly. The men come upstairs. They ask politely for the papers. Chavigny gives them the astronomical tables. They take those and set them aside without looking at them. One of them asks about a sealed document. He does not ask whether there is one. He asks where it is. And here Chavigny's account simply stops. The next paragraph begins 3 weeks later and concerns the settlement of the estate. The envelope is never mentioned again. Not in the will, which lists the contents of a locked box down to individual coins. Not in the inventory. Not in any of Chavigny's later writings. And he wrote a great deal about Nostradamus, made a career of it, published a book of commentary in 1594 in which he claimed to have been entrusted with the master's secrets. He mentions the secrets constantly. He never once names them. Now, 500 years later, the story picks up in a reading room on the 2nd floor of a library in Paris, on an afternoon in early autumn, where a woman is looking at a book and beginning to feel the floor tilt. Her name is Dr. Isabelle Laurent. She's 41 years old. She has spent 17 years studying the printing history of 16th century France, which is a field small enough that she knows most of the people in it by their handwriting. She is not, and this matters, a believer in prophecy. She finds the entire Nostradamus industry tedious. Her interest in Le Prophetie is bibliographic. She cares about which edition came from which press, which typeface was used, which errors propagated from one printing to the next. She's the sort of scholar who can date a book by the wear pattern on a single damaged letter. She has, in front of her, 3 early editions, one from 1555, one from 1557, one from 1568, printed after his death. She's comparing them for a paper on printing house practices, nothing more, and she has noticed something that will not let her go. It began as an irritation. 3 weeks earlier, cataloguing the 1555 edition, she had found herself annoyed by the ordering of the verses, not intellectually, physically. The way a crooked picture on a wall is physically annoying, because the disorder was not random. That was the thing. Real randomness has a texture. Laurent had spent her career with jumbled manuscripts, and jumbled manuscripts look jumbled. They have clusters, they have repetitions, they have places where the printer clearly dropped a stack and picked it up wrong, and you can see the seam. Le Prophetie has no seams. The disorder is too even. Every verse is maximally distant from every verse it resembles. Every image that could pair with another image has been separated by dozens of pages. It is as though somebody had taken a deck of cards and instead of shuffling it, had painstakingly arranged it so that no two cards of the same suit were ever adjacent. That is not disorder, that is work. So she had started counting. She began with the obvious things: verse length, rhyme schemes, the distribution of proper nouns. She looked for acrostics, because everyone always looks for acrostics, and found nothing but the usual false positives that turn up in any large body of text. Then she looked at the words that had always bothered scholars most, the astronomical ones, because scattered through the verses seemingly at random are references to planets, not vague poetic references to stars and heavens, specific ones: Saturn in a particular sign, Mars conjunct with Jupiter, the moon in a certain quarter, Mercury retrograde. Some verses have one, some have three. Most have none at all. Traditional commentators had always treated these as decoration, astrological flavour, sprinkled in to make the verses sound learned. Laurent, who did not believe in astrology but did believe in mathematics, treated them as data. There are, she found, 141 quatrains in the early editions that contain at least one specific and unambiguous planetary position, 141 points, and a point is only useless until you have enough of them. She went to the astronomy department and found a graduate student willing to be bribed with coffee, and together they loaded a piece of open-source planetarium software, the kind anyone can download, the kind that can rewind the sky to any moment in the last several thousand years. They set the location to Salon-de-Provence, longitude 5 degrees 6 minutes east, latitude 43 degrees 38 minutes north. They set the date to the 1st of March, 1555, and they began to run the sky forward. Here is what the graduate student expected to happen. He expected the 141 planetary configurations to be scattered arbitrarily across the 16th century, because that is what happens when a poet name-drops planets for effect. He expected noise. Here is what happened instead. Every single one of the 141 configurations occurred within a window of 11 months, between March of 1555 and February of 1556. Not one fell outside it. The student stopped talking. Laurent remembers the exact moment, because he had been chewing the end of a pen, and he took it out of his mouth and set it down on the desk very carefully, as though it had become fragile. Configurations of planets are not rare individually. Any given arrangement recurs, but 141 specific arrangements all falling inside a single 11-month window, when the text spans a book supposedly covering thousands of years of future history, is not a thing that happens by accident. It means the sky in those verses is not the sky of the future. It is the sky over one man's head, in one town during 1 year, while he was writing. He had been stamping them, like a postmark. Every verse carried, hidden inside its imagery, the date and time it was composed, and that meant the verses could be put back in order. Laurent did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table in an apartment in the 11th arrondissement with a printout of the 141 verses and a list of timestamps, and she began by hand to sort them. The first thing she noticed was that the order in the printed book bore no relationship at all to the order of composition. Verse 2 of Century 1 had been written in the autumn. Verse 80 of Century 3 had been written the previous spring. They were not merely shuffled, they had been deliberately, systematically interleaved. The second thing she noticed took longer, and it was the thing that changed everything. When she laid the reordered verses out in chronological sequence, they stopped being separate. Try to imagine this properly, because it is the hinge of the entire story. Imagine a book of 1,000 unconnected images, a burning tower, a dead king, a river of blood, a city under ash, each one self-contained, each one hauntingly vague, each one capable of meaning anything at all. That is les prophecies. as the world has read it for 500 years. Now imagine taking those same images and putting them in a different order, and discovering that the last line of one continues into the first line of the next. Not always, not perfectly. Perhaps 6 times out of 10. But 6 times out of 10 is not coincidence when your sample is hundreds of verses. The reordered text was not a collection. It was a chain. The great man falls in verse 41, and in verse 42, which the book had printed 200 pages away, someone is carrying his body through a gate. The city burns in one verse, and in the next the smoke is on the water. A child is born in one verse, and in the next a woman is fleeing north with something wrapped in cloth. The verses were sentences. Somebody had cut a paragraph into pieces and dealt the pieces out like cards. Lauren stopped at 4 a.m. because her hand was cramping. She had reordered 81 verses. They told a continuous story that started, as far as she could tell, roughly in her own century. She did not finish it. She would think about that later, obsessively, the way you think about a door you did not open. She stacked the pages, went to bed, lay awake until it got light, and went into the department at 8. And she made the decision that would cost her everything. She wrote it up. Not the wild version. Not one word about prophecy, because Laurent had a career and understood exactly how quickly you can lose one. She wrote 9 pages of extremely dry bibliographic argument, titled Compositional Sequencing in the Early Editions of Les Prophéties, in which she proposed that the astronomical references function as internal dating markers, and that the printed order of the verses is therefore not authorial, but editorial. The paper made a modest and defensible claim, that we have been reading the book in the wrong order for 500 years, and that fixing the order was a legitimate research problem. She submitted it to a small journal of early modern print culture, with a readership of perhaps 400 people. It was published on a Thursday in November. On the following Tuesday, someone came into her office. She knew before she reached the door. There is a particular sound a room makes when it has been disturbed, and the human ear is very good at hearing it. She stood in the corridor with her key in her hand and knew, and could not have told you how. The office looked, at first, completely normal. That was the strange part. Nothing was overturned. No drawers hung open. Her laptop was on the desk where she had left it, closed, warm to the touch, in the way a laptop is warm when it has been opened recently. Her coat was on the hook. Her coffee cup was in the same ring of dried coffee it had been standing in for a week. But the books on the shelf behind her desk had been put back in the wrong order. Not shuffled. Reversed. 4 volumes of a 9-volume series, in perfect sequence but running the other way, as though someone had taken them all out, stacked them, and put them back from the top of the stack instead of the bottom. The kind of mistake that only a person in a hurry makes, and only a person who has taken out every single book. She checked what she always checked. Her passport was in the drawer. The petty cash tin had €11 in it, untouched. The department laptop, worth more than everything else in the room combined, sat there closed and unstolen. Her notes were gone. Not all of them. That was the detail that made her hands go cold. 17 years of notes on printing history filled 2 cabinets, and every one of those files was still there. Only the folder marked with the sequence was missing. The handwritten reordering, the 141 timestamps, the 81 verses she had chained together at her kitchen table. She reported it. Campus security took a statement and made sympathetic noises about students and drug problems. The report went into a system where it presumably still sits. She did not tell them the thing that frightened her most, because saying it out loud would have made her sound unwell. Her paper had been published 5 days earlier, in a journal with 400 subscribers. It contained no mention of any hidden meaning, no claim of prophecy, nothing but a dry bibliographic proposal about compositional order. For someone to have read that paper, understood what it implied, located her office, and searched it with that degree of precision, within 5 days they would have to have already known what they were looking for. They were not learning something new, they were checking whether she'd found it. The letter came 4 months later, from a place she had not been looking. Laurent had gone quiet after the break-in. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a scholar's instinct for cover. She stopped talking about the sequence. She published 2 unrelated papers on watermarks. She let it be known that she had moved on, and she started digging in archives that had nothing to do with printing. The correspondence of the papal legates in France in the 1550s runs to thousands of documents, most of them dull beyond description, concerning benefices and appointments and money. It is not a collection anyone reads for pleasure. It has been catalogued, but catalogued the way large boring collections are catalogued, which is to say by sender, recipient and date, with a one-line summary that is frequently wrong. She found it in a bundle summarised as concerning a dispute over a mill. The letter is dated the 9th of September, 1556. It is addressed to Michel de Nostradamus, physician, at Salon-de-Provence. It comes from a senior official attached to the papal nuncio in Paris, a man whose name appears elsewhere in the record only in administrative contexts. It is not a threat. That is what makes it so unsettling. It is warm. It opens with a courtesy about the recipient's health and refers to a previous conversation, in person, at some unspecified location. It thanks him for his frankness. It mentions, in passing, a shared acquaintance. And then, in the middle of a paragraph about something else entirely, it says this, that certain verses must never be placed together. That is all. No explanation. No specification of which verses. No reason. The sentence sits in the middle of the letter like a stone in a loaf of bread, and the paragraph continues afterward as though nothing has happened, discussing the health of a mutual friend in Avignon. Laurent read it 11 times. The most maddening thing about it is the word placed. Not read, not written, not published. Placed. It is a spatial word. A word about arrangement. Somebody, in 1556, 1 year after the first edition appeared, was already discussing the order of the verses as a thing that mattered, as a thing with rules, as a thing that could be done wrongly. The letter has 3 pages. It should have 4. The final page has been removed. Not torn, which would leave a ragged edge. Cut cleanly, close to the binding with something sharp, by someone who cared about the appearance of the remaining document. The catalogue entry, written in 1891, describes the letter as complete, which means it was cut after that. She photographed all 3 surviving pages, twice on 2 different devices, and emailed one set to an old friend in Montreal with a message asking him to keep it and not open it. That night in a bar near the archive, a man sat down opposite her without being invited. He was in his late 70s, small, neat, in a grey coat, with the specific self-effacing tidiness of a man who has spent a working life in rooms where noise is discouraged. He put a folded newspaper on the table between them and did not look at her when he spoke. He said he had read her paper. Laurent said that made 2 of them. He smiled at that briefly, and then he told her his name, which she has never repeated, and told her he had worked for 34 years in the archival service of the French state, and had retired 11 years ago, and had been waiting since November for somebody to publish exactly what she had published. Then he asked her a question. He asked whether she had ever wondered why the French state has, since the 17th century, employed people to read a book of poems. Here is what he told her. In the reign of Louis XIV, France perfected an institution called the Cabinet Noir, the Black Chamber. This part is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history, taught in universities, and any historian of the period will confirm it in broad detail. The Cabinet Noir was a room in the postal service where letters were opened, not randomly, systematically. Staff would take a sealed letter, soften the wax with steam, lift the seal intact, copy the contents, reseal the letter with a forged stamp cut for the purpose, and return it to the mail, all within an hour or 2 so that the recipient noticed nothing. They employed linguists, cryptographers, and forgers. They kept ledgers. It was one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in Europe, and it ran in one form or another for centuries. That is the real history. Now, the story. The old man told Laurent that inside the Cabinet Noir from roughly 1680 onward, there existed a small subsection with its own budget line, its own staff, and its own locked room. It did not read letters. It read editions of Les Prophecies, every new printing, every translation, every commentary, every pirated edition out of Amsterdam or Geneva or London. Copies were purchased, catalogued and compared line by line against a master text held in the room. He said the subsection has never been formally dissolved. He said it has changed ministries 11 times, changed names more often than that, been folded into other departments, been given deliberately dull designations relating to manuscript conservation, and has, at various points, been funded through budget lines for things like paper procurement and building maintenance. He said he worked adjacent to it for 9 years and was never once told what it was. He worked it out the way archivists work things out, by noticing that certain requisitions did not make sense. That a department supposedly concerned with the conservation of paper was buying, every year, several copies of a book that has been in print continuously since 1555, in editions that had no conservation value whatsoever, cheap modern paperbacks, in 9 languages. Why would you buy a cheap modern paperback for a conservation archive? You would not, unless you were not conserving it, unless you were checking it. Laurent asked him the obvious question, the one you're asking now, checking it for what? And the old man said the thing that she would think about every night for the next year. He said the archive is not looking for prophecies. He said that is the mistake everyone makes, and that the mistake is useful, because it makes the whole thing sound ridiculous, and things that sound ridiculous do not get investigated. The archive already has the sequence. It has had the sequence in complete or near complete form since the 17th century. Its function has never been to discover anything. Its function is to make sure nobody else can. He explained the mechanism, and it is so simple that Laurent said her first reaction was not fear, but professional admiration. You do not need to ban a book. Banning a book makes people want it. You do not need to burn it. Burning creates martyrs, and copies survive anyway. You only need to be involved in printing it. A word here, a comma there, a line reversed, an accent moved, a number changed from one form to another. Each individual alteration is meaningless, indistinguishable from ordinary printer's error, of which the 16th century produced an ocean. But if the meaning of the whole depends on the order, and the order depends on the astronomical markers, and the astronomical markers depend on precise wording, then you do not have to destroy the code, you only have to introduce noise. Corrupt enough markers and the sequence becomes unrecoverable, not because the information is gone, but because it can no longer be distinguished from the errors around it. You do not silence the book. You let it shout forever, in a language nobody can reassemble. And the beautiful part, the old man said, the part that made him certain it was real, is that the strategy is self-concealing. Because for 500 years the standard scholarly explanation for the textual chaos in Les Prophecies has been that early modern printers were sloppy, which is true, which is exactly why it works. So Laurent went looking for the noise. This is the part of the story that is least dramatic and most convincing, because it is simply what a good scholar does. She did not chase a hidden archive. She did not try to find the old man again, and he never contacted her. She did the boring, grinding, beautiful work of textual criticism, which is the discipline of comparing versions of a text until the differences tell you something. She assembled everything she could reach. The 1555 lion printing, the 1557 lion printing, of which 2 variant states exist. The 1558 edition, which may never have existed at all and survives only in later reprints. The Antwerp printing of 1590, the Troy edition of 1611, Amsterdam, Leiden, the English translations of the 1670s, 19 different printings across 200 years in 5 languages photographed page by page. Then she compared them, not for meaning, for characters, and what she found is the reason she stopped sleeping properly. The differences between editions cluster. That is the whole finding, and it takes a moment to see why it is devastating. If early modern printers were simply sloppy, the errors between editions would be scattered evenly through the text. Some pages would be clean, some messy, but over 19 editions the noise would smooth out into an even wash across the whole book. It does not. 94% of the substantive variations between editions occur in the 141 verses that contain astronomical markers. Those verses represent about 14% of the text. Read that again slowly. The verses that carry the timestamps, the verses that make the sequence recoverable, are corrupted at a rate roughly 8 times higher than the rest of the book. And the corruptions are of a very particular kind. A number changes. In one edition, Saturn sits in one sign, in the next it sits in the neighbouring one. A single letter. In one printing, Mars and Jupiter are joined. In another, they are opposed. One word. In one printing, a phase of the moon is described as waxing, in the next as waning. Every one of these changes is trivial as poetry. You could read both versions aloud and hear no difference worth mentioning. A commentator interested in meaning would never notice. Every one of these changes moves the timestamp by weeks or months. And here is the detail that made Laurent put her head down on the desk in a reading room in Antwerp and stay like that for several minutes. The changes are not random in direction. If they were errors, half of them would move a date earlier and half would move it later, and across enough of them the whole thing would blur outward symmetrically, the way noise does. They do not blur outward. They converge. The corruptions across 200 years and 5 countries and dozens of printing houses that had no connection to each other all push the timestamps toward the middle of the window, toward a cluster, toward a soft grey, undifferentiated mass in which no verse can be reliably ordered relative to any other. Somebody was not damaging the text. Somebody was flattening it, patiently, across generations, in printing houses in different countries under different governments in different centuries, in a coordinated, unhurried campaign of tiny edits, the way water is patient with stone. Laurent worked backward. If the corruptions converge on the middle, then the uncorrupted values lie at the edges, and if you have 19 editions and you can identify which readings are original by looking at which are most extreme, most specific, most awkward, most difficult, then you can begin, verse by verse, to undo it. It took her 14 months. She did it in a rented apartment in Lyon, in a city Nostradamus had published in, working with printouts covering the floor of a room she stopped letting anyone enter. She used no computers connected to any network. She wrote on paper. She photographed each night's work and mailed the photographs to 3 separate people who did not know each other and were told only to keep the envelopes sealed. She recovered, by her own count, 119 of the 141 timestamps with reasonable confidence, and with 119 fixed points, the rest of the verses could be placed by interpolation, by imagery, by the chaining she had noticed at her kitchen table 2 years earlier, where the end of one verse walks directly into the beginning of the next. She reassembled les prophecies, not perfectly. She would say that for the rest of her life, insistently, to anyone who would listen. Not perfectly. There were gaps. There were verses she could not place at all. There were passages where 3 orderings were equally defensible. But she had, for the first time in nearly 5 centuries, a version of the book that read like a document instead of a pile. And this is where I have to tell you what she found, and where I have to remind you again, gently, that this is a story. The reassembled text is not a list of predictions. It is a chronicle. It reads, from beginning to end, like the memoir of somebody describing events they have already lived through, written in a hurry, out of order, from memory, with the details that stuck and none of the ones that did not. It begins with a river and a city and a bad harvest, in what appears to be the 16th century itself, and it moves forward. Laurent's own summary, which she wrote for herself and never published, ran to 60 pages. What follows is compressed almost to nothing. There is a long passage about a king who is not killed by an enemy, but by his own people, about a queen whose name is never given, taken from a garden, about a numbered order of days replacing the old one, and months given new names, and a machine that is described only as a blade that never tires. There is a passage about a small man from an island who is not born to rule and rules anyway, who marches east into snow, and who returns with a tenth of what he took. There is a very long section in which the chronicle becomes almost tedious, describing smoke, iron, children in factories, rivers that catch fire, and cities that double and double again. Whoever wrote it clearly found this period exhausting. Then it becomes frightening. There is a passage about a war that begins with a shot fired at a man in a carriage, and ends with a generation buried in mud in trenches, and the phrase that Laurent could not get out of her head was the description of the war as the one that everyone believed was the last. Then a second one, worse, with a description of ovens that she would not read aloud. Then a light. This section is the most cited by every commentator who has ever written about Nostradamus, and in Laurent's reordering it appears exactly where it should appear, between the war and what comes after. A light brighter than the sun contained in a small object, carried by a metal bird that leaves a shadow burned into stone. Then men walking on the moon, described as a place with no wind where the footprints stay. Then a net, cast over the whole world, made of nothing physical, through which every person can speak to every other person, and through which, the chronicle says, more lies travel than truths, and by which the powerful learn everything about the powerless, while remaining unseen themselves. Now, stop, breathe. Because everything I have just described can be found in existing Nostradamus commentary. All of it. Every one of those readings has been proposed by somebody at some point over the last 400 years, and mainstream historians have systematically demolished every single one of them, and they are right to. The verses are vague. The imagery is generic. Fire and blood and towers and kings are the raw material of all 16th century poetry. Any sufficiently long collection of ambiguous images will appear to predict anything you look for because you are the one supplying the connections. This is a well-documented feature of human cognition, and it has a name, and the name is retrofitting. Laurent knew all of this. She had spent her career being the person who said it at conferences. Her argument was narrower and stranger, and it was this. She was not claiming the verses were accurate. She was claiming they were consecutive. Anyone can find a verse that fits an event. What nobody had ever been able to do was find verses that fit events in the right order without cheating, and the reordered text, ordered by a mechanical criterion that had nothing to do with meaning, ordered purely by planetary positions calculated by software that knew nothing about history, put them in the right order. The astronomy did not know about Napoleon. It just put the verse there. That is the claim. Make of it what you will. And then there is the last part of the document, and it is different. The change is abrupt. Laurent described it as being like the moment in a piece of music where the key changes and everything sounds slightly wrong before it sounds right. Somewhere past the net that covers the world, the writing sharpens. The vagueness stops. Up to that point, the chronicle has been impressionistic. Fire, blood, kings, cities. From that point on, it becomes technical. It gives conjunctions with degrees. It specifies which planets, in which signs, at what elongation. It refers to eclipses with reference to their path. It describes the position of a comet relative to fixed stars. In one place it gives a lunar distance to a precision that Laurent's astronomer friend said was frankly implausible for the instruments available in 1555, and then said, after a pause, that it was not implausible if the man had simply been very, very patient. Whoever wrote this section was no longer writing for the reader of his own century. Poetic imagery is written for people. Coordinates are written for instruments. He was writing for somebody with a telescope, somebody with tables, somebody who could take a set of angular measurements and turn them into a date. He was writing for us. And the last thing in the reconstructed manuscript is a hole. Laurent found it because the chain broke. She had spent 2 years learning the rhythm of the thing, the way the last line of one verse leans into the first line of the next, and near the end the lean stops. One verse ends mid-image, with a figure standing at a threshold, and the next verse begins in the aftermath of something that has clearly already happened, with the same figure walking away. Something belongs between them. She could measure the gap precisely, because the astronomical timestamps on either side of it left a window, and the window was narrow. Exactly one quatrain is missing. She searched for it for 11 months. She examined every edition, every variant, every apocryphal verse ever attributed to Nostradamus, every fragment quoted in letters or commentaries or hostile pamphlets. It is not there. It has never been there. It was not lost, and this is the crucial distinction. Lost material leaves scars. Printers leave a gap, or a note, or a mismatched catchword, or a page number that skips. There is no scar. The verse was removed before the first edition was ever set in type, which means the man who removed it was the man who wrote it. He built a document that could only be read by somebody clever enough to reassemble it, and then he took out the one piece that would make it mean anything, and he took that piece somewhere else. Destroy this before they arrive. The envelope in Salon-de-Provence in July of 1566 with 6 words on the front. Laurent had been reading about that envelope for 2 years and dismissing it as Chavigny's invention. Sitting on the floor of an apartment in Lyon at 2 a.m, surrounded by paper, she stopped dismissing it. Because Chavigny had described the envelope as heavy, thicker than a letter, thick enough to hold something more than a single verse, thick enough perhaps to hold a single verse and an explanation of what it meant. They came to her in February, not in a car park, not in a dark stairwell, not in any of the ways the films have taught us to expect, and Laurent said afterward that the ordinariness of it was the thing that finally broke her scepticism, because nobody staging a deception would have chosen anything so dull. A woman came to her door on a Tuesday morning and asked whether she could come in. She was perhaps 60. She wore a raincoat that had been expensive 20 years earlier. She had a canvas bag with a supermarket logo on it. She apologised for the hour, accepted tea, and sat on the edge of the sofa like someone waiting to be seen by a dentist. She said that her organisation had been aware of Laurent's work for 2 years, and had decided, after considerable disagreement, that it was time to speak to her. Laurent asked what the organisation was called. The woman said they had used many names, and that the current one, which they had used for about 200 years, was the Custodians of the 9th century. The 9th century of the book, the one that contains the greatest number of the astronomical verses, the one they exist to protect. Here is what she told her, over 4 hours, on a Tuesday, drinking tea that went cold twice. They are not a religious order. They have no doctrine, no ritual, no building, and no leader. They have never asked anyone for money. They have never recruited anybody who was not already, independently, close to figuring it out on their own, which is an approach that has kept them very small. They began in 1566, in the weeks after the funeral, and the first of them was Chavigny. He did not hand over the envelope. He gave the officials a different sealed packet containing astronomical tables and a decoy, and they took it because they did not know precisely what they were looking for either. Then he spent the next 28 years of his life publishing commentary on Nostradamus that was deliberately, exquisitely misleading, seeding the field with false interpretations, encouraging the idea that the verses were individual predictions to be matched against individual events. He invented, single-handedly, the entire tradition of Nostradamus commentary that persists to this day. He invented it as camouflage. Every ridiculous documentary, every supermarket paperback, every breathless article claiming the verses foretold some disaster, all of it grows from the tradition Chavigny planted, and all of it serves the same function it served in 1594. It makes the subject radioactive to serious people. It ensures that any scholar who approaches the material is presumed to be a crank before they open their mouth. The best place to hide something is inside a joke. The custodians have numbered at any moment somewhere between 4 and 30 people. They are archivists and printers and typesetters, and, in the modern era, people who work on digitisation projects. They do not steal, they do not threaten. Their entire operational method for 460 years has consisted of introducing small errors into new editions of a book. That is it. That is the whole conspiracy. They are not the archive. This is the part that made Laurent set down her cup. The black cabinet is real, the woman said, or at least the thing the old archivist described is real, and it is not on their side, and it is not on anyone else's either. States have always kept an eye on the sequence. So have others. There have been, over the centuries, at least 4 separate groups attempting to reconstruct the order, and the custodians have spent most of their existence quietly ensuring that all of them fail, including, when necessary, by corrupting the text further. Laurent asked the obvious question. If they wanted it to stay hidden, why not simply destroy the original? And the woman said the thing that reframes everything. Because it might be needed. She said the position the custodians have held since the 16th century is not that the prophecy is dangerous. It is that the reaction to it would be. A thing can be true and still be poison, she said, if it arrives in a mind that cannot hold it. They have never believed people should never know. They have believed consistently across 4 centuries and roughly 14 generations that people should not know yet. And then Laurent asked about the governments, and got an answer she was not expecting. The woman laughed, not unkindly. She said that the most persistent misunderstanding about the whole affair, the one that has protected it better than any lock, is the assumption that anyone in power believes in prophecy. They do not. Not one of them. No president has ever made a decision because of a poem. No ministry has ever set policy from a quatrain. The idea is absurd, and everyone inside the system knows it is absurd, and that is precisely why the system survives, because the moment somebody suggests it out loud, they sound insane. What the archives actually do is much stranger and much more rational. They use it as a comparison. Imagine you possess a document of unknown origin and unknown reliability, which describes a sequence of events. Imagine that the earlier portions of that sequence match recorded history with an accuracy you cannot easily explain but also cannot easily verify, because the language is ambiguous enough to permit argument. You would not act on it. You would be a fool to act on it, but you would watch it. You would take the portions describing events that have not yet occurred, and you would maintain a quiet, low-cost, deniable process by which somebody, once a year, compares the world to the document, not to predict, to measure divergence. 99 years out of 100, the world and the document have nothing to do with each other, and the analyst files a report saying so, and everyone forgets about it for another year. But if the world began to converge, if events started falling into the order described, and kept falling into it, and the correspondence tightened rather than loosened, then you would want to know that. Not because you believed in prophecy, because you would want to know why a document written in 1555 was tracking your reality, and you would want to know it early. It is not a crystal ball, the woman said. It is a smoke detector, and smoke detectors are not magic. They do not know what fire is. They simply notice a change in the composition of the air and make a noise so that somebody who can think will come and look. Laurent asked how many times it had made a noise. The woman said that she did not know exactly, but that the reason her organisation existed in its current form, with its current urgency, was that the number was not 0. She said there had been 3 periods in the last 100 years during which the convergence tightened sharply. She named none of them. She said only that in each case the tightening lasted between 4 and 19 months, and in each case it relaxed again, and in each case the people watching it went back to filing their annual reports and saying nothing to anybody. And then Laurent asked about the missing verse. The woman was quiet for a long moment. Outside, in the street, someone was trying to park badly, and the sound of it went on and on. She said the verse exists. She said it has existed continuously since 1566. It has never been destroyed. It has been moved perhaps 9 times. It has spent long periods in places nobody would think to look, including, for most of the 19th century, inside the binding of an extremely boring book about drainage. And then she said the thing that Laurent has repeated in every private conversation she has had since, and which she says she still does not fully understand. She said that the verse has never been read aloud in its complete form, not never read. Read, certainly. Perhaps 24 people have read it silently in 4.5 centuries. But the manuscript comes with an instruction, in Nostradamus' own hand, that the verse must be spoken aloud, in sequence, with the verses on either side of it, in order for its meaning to resolve. Laurent asked why, and the woman said she did not know, that nobody knew, and that the custodians had argued about it for 400 years without agreement. Some believed it was a mnemonic device. Some believed the verse contained a phonetic layer, a pun, or an anagram that only surfaces in sound. Some believed it was simply an old man's superstition, and some believed it was a test. Because here is the part that is documented in their own records, in 11 separate accounts spanning from 1641 to 1978. Every single person who has attempted to read the completed sequence aloud has stopped before finishing. Not one of them was prevented. Not one was interrupted. Nobody took the page away. They stopped. The accounts, the woman said, are remarkably consistent and remarkably unhelpful. Each reader stops within the final 6 lines. Each one puts the page down. Several of them are described as apologising. One, in 1792, is recorded as having laughed for a considerable period and then asking, apparently seriously, what day of the week it was. And when they are asked afterward why they stopped, they give the same answer, or answers close enough to the same that it can only be described one way. They say that they had already heard it before. They drove south in April. Laurent has never said who was in the car. She has said that there were 4 of them, that nobody spoke for the first 2 hours, and that somewhere around Valence the woman in the raincoat fell asleep with her head against the window, like anybody's aunt on a long journey, and that this, more than anything, made the whole thing feel real. They left the motorway in the late afternoon and drove into the hills. The observatory sits on a ridge above a valley, an hour from anywhere, and it has been abandoned since the 1970s. It was built in 1881, extended in 1912, and closed when light pollution and better instruments elsewhere made it pointless. The dome is still there, seized in place, streaked with rust the colour of dried blood. The main building has broken windows on the upper floor and a padlock on the door that is newer than everything around it. Inside it smells of dust and birds. There is a lecture room with a blackboard still bearing the ghost of chalk. There is a library with empty shelves. There is a corridor with a floor of black and white tiles, half of them cracked, and at the end of the corridor a door to what the plans describe as a coal cellar. The stairs behind it go down much further than a coal cellar needs, and at the bottom they are not from 1881. This is where Laurent's account becomes precise, in the way people become precise when they are trying to convince themselves they were paying attention. She describes the masonry. She describes the vaulting, which she says is medieval or earlier, and the way the stones are laid, and the marks on them, and the fact that the chamber predates the observatory by centuries. And the observatory was, she realised standing there, not a building with a secret underneath it. It was a lid. Somebody built an observatory on top of this place in 1881 because an observatory is a legitimate reason to own a remote hilltop and restrict access to it and employ people who work at night. The chamber is not large, perhaps 6 metres by 4. The air is dry and cold and very still. There are 11 wooden chests along one wall, and Laurent was not shown what is in 10 of them. The 11th was opened on a table in the middle of the room, under a battery lamp, and inside it, wrapped in linen and then in oiled silk, was a bound manuscript that no scholar has ever catalogued. She describes the moment of seeing the handwriting. She had spent 18 years looking at reproductions of Nostradamus' hand, in wills, in letters, in the margins of ephemerides. She knew it the way you know a friend's walk from 100 metres away, and there it was, in front of her, in a cellar under a hill, in ink that had gone the colour of strong tea. The manuscript is not Les Prophecies. It is a different document in the same hand, and it is written in order. The verses are numbered. There are annotations in the margins that appear nowhere in any printed edition, brief notes in Latin, mostly astronomical, occasionally something else. Beside one verse, in the middle of the section about the War of Trenches, there is a single word in French that translates roughly as again, and there is a gap. Near the end, between two numbered verses, a space has been left. Not an error. A deliberate blank, the size of 4 lines, with the numbering continuing correctly on either side. The woman in the raincoat opened the canvas bag with the supermarket logo on it. Inside was a flat wooden case. Inside that, between 2 sheets of glass, was a single leaf of paper, and on it were 4 lines. Laurent said the strangest thing about the missing quatrain was how unremarkable it looked. She said she had expected, without ever admitting the expectation to herself, that it would somehow announce itself, that it would be written differently, or larger, or with more care. It is not. It is scrawled. It is the handwriting of a man in a hurry, or a man whose hands were not steady, and there is a smudge across the 3rd line where his sleeve dragged through wet ink, and he did not stop to fix it. They laid it in the gap. For the first time in 460 years, the document was complete. Now. Before I tell you what it says, I want you to notice something about your own body. You've been listening to this for a while now. Your breathing has slowed. You're warm. Somewhere in the last 20 minutes you probably stopped tracking the details and started just riding the sound of it, and that is exactly right. That is what this is for. I am telling you this because what comes next is the part of the story that people find upsetting, and I want you to hear it from a comfortable place. Nothing in it is real. Nothing in it is going to happen. It is a fiction about a fiction, and you are lying safely in the dark, and the only true things in this room are your blanket and your breathing. All right. The final prophecy is not about a war. There is no plague, no asteroid, no fire from the sky, no Antichrist, no flood, none of the furniture that 4 centuries of commentators have hung on the end of Nostradamus, and Laurent said that the absence of all that was the first thing that frightened her, because a fake would have delivered. A fake would have given the audience what it came for. The completed sequence says, as nearly as it can be rendered in modern language, this: that the world you are standing in has not been standing here as long as you believe. That history has a seam in it, and the seam has been sewn many times. That the sequence of events leading to this moment has been altered on more occasions than anyone has counted, and that each time it is altered, everything realigns behind the change. Records realign, buildings realign, memories realign. The evidence is not covered up because there is nothing to cover up. The past does not become hidden, it becomes never. And almost nobody notices because there is nothing to notice with. Your memory is part of the world being rewritten. You cannot detect a change to the ruler using the ruler. Almost nobody, but not quite nobody. The document claims, in the closing section, that a very small number of people in every generation retain fragments. Not visions, not knowledge, fragments. Debris left over from a version of events that no longer exists, floating loose in a mind that has otherwise been corrected. It describes these people with a word that Laurent translates, imperfectly, as leftovers. They do not know what they have. It arrives as sourceless certainty, absolute conviction about a thing you have no reason to be convinced of, the knowledge that a place you have never been will have a red door, the sense, on a specific afternoon, that you have done all of this before, in this order, with these words, in this light. And Nostradamus, according to the document, was one of them, the largest one anybody had encountered, a man whose retention was so heavy, so persistent, that he could not function around it, and who spent 30 years in an upstairs room at night trying to write it down before it faded. He was not seeing the future, he was remembering it. Sit with the elegance of that for a moment, because whatever else it is elegant, and it explains almost everything that is strange about the man. It explains the fragmentation. Memory does not arrive as narrative. It arrives as pieces, a face, a smell, a room, out of sequence, without context. Anyone who has ever tried to write down a dream at 4 a.m. knows exactly what these verses look like, because they look like that. It explains the vagueness. He was not being coy about iron birds and metal horses and machines that eat cities. He was doing what any person does when trying to describe an object for which no word exists in their language. He was reaching for the nearest available thing. It explains why the images are always violent and rarely happy. Traumatic memory persists. Ordinary memory does not. A man carrying debris from erased timelines would not carry the quiet afternoons. He would carry the fires. It explains the timestamps. He was not encoding the date the event would happen. He could not. He did not know when any of it happened, only that it had. He was recording the date and time he remembered it, which is the only date he actually possessed. The 141 astronomical markers are not prophetic. They are the 16th century equivalent of writing the time in the corner of a page in a notebook, and it explains most of all the scrambling. He shuffled his own manuscript, not to hide it from the Inquisition, to hide it from himself. Because the document contains, in its final section, a passage in which he explains why. And this is the passage that Laurent says she has read perhaps 300 times. He writes that when the pieces are apart, they are only sorrows. A burning city is a sad thing to remember, and a man can carry 100 sad things. But when they are placed in order, they stop being memories. They become a route, and a route can be followed. There is one more thing in the completed manuscript, and it is the reason for all of it. The archive, the corruptions, the 4 centuries of small, quiet sabotage. The document ends with a date, not a vague one, not a season, or a reign, or the age of a king. The final passage gives an astronomical configuration, specified to a precision that made Laurent's astronomer friend stop returning her calls for 6 weeks, and then call her back at 1 a.m. to say that he had run it 4 different ways, and it resolved to a single window, and that windows like that recur roughly once every several thousand years. It has not occurred yet. And here is the shape of the thing, the reason the custodians exist, the reason there is a locked room in a ministry with a budget line for paper. The document does not say what happens on that date. That is the whole horror of it, and if you are the sort of person who finds unfinished things worse than finished ones, you already understand. It says only that the chronicle has reached that point before, more than once. The manuscript gives a number of previous occasions, and Laurent has never said what the number is, only that it is small enough to count on your hands and large enough to make her feel sick. Each time, everything before that date proceeded roughly as it proceeds now. Different in details, the same in shape, the same wars, more or less, the same discoveries, more or less, the same slow crawl out of the mud and into the light. And each time, past that point, the chronicle stops, not ends, stops. Mid-line, mid-image, the way a recording stops when the tape runs out, and then begins again at the beginning, in the 16th century, with a river and a city and a bad harvest. No version has continued past it unchanged. Now hold that next to the thing the woman in the raincoat said about smoke detectors, and you will see why a document nobody believes in has been guarded by professionals for 300 years. Nobody in any ministry thinks the poem is magic, but a document that describes prior iterations and encodes a terminal condition and matches your recorded history closely enough to be uncomfortable is a document you would want to be watching. Not because you would act on it, because if the convergence ever tightened as that date approached, you would want somebody in a room somewhere to have been counting. They have been counting since Louis XIV. They are counting now. They will not tell you the number, and they will not tell you the date, and if you ask them directly they would look at you with the mild, patient, faintly amused expression of a person who deals with the public, and they would tell you it is a poem. And they would be telling the truth. It is a poem. That is all any of this ever was. Laurent was offered a choice, in a cellar under a hill in Provence, at some hour of the night she cannot reconstruct. She could publish. Nobody would stop her. That is what she found hardest to accept, and what finally persuaded her that the custodians were exactly what they claimed to be. The woman in the raincoat told her that the manuscript would be photographed for her, in full, at whatever resolution she wanted, that she could take the images with her, that no one would follow her or threaten her or visit her office again. They had one condition, and it was not really a condition. It was a request, that she think about it for a year. They pointed out, without pressure, that the completed document is not proof of anything, that a manuscript in an unverified hand from an unverified provenance found in a cellar with no chain of custody would be dismissed by every serious scholar within a week, and that Laurent knew this better than they did, because she was one of the scholars who would dismiss it. They pointed out that the reordering itself, the 14 months of textual work, the 119 recovered timestamps, was genuine scholarship and would survive scrutiny, and that she should publish that, and that they would not interfere. And then the woman said the only thing in 4 hours that sounded like an argument. She said that in every previous iteration of the Chronicle, somebody worked it out. Somebody always does. The code is not that hard. It was designed, quite deliberately, to be solvable by anyone patient enough, because a man who wants a message destroyed does not encrypt it. He burns it, and Nostradamus did not burn anything. He wanted it found. Eventually. The question was never whether. The question was when. And the custodian's position, held with remarkable consistency across 460 years by people who otherwise agreed on nothing, is that every previous time it was found early, and every previous time it was found early, the Chronicle stopped shortly afterward. Not because the knowledge is destructive, because of what people do with a root. A thing that is only a sorrow when scattered becomes a set of instructions when ordered, and humanity, presented with a document claiming to describe the shape of its own ending, has never yet responded by putting the document down. Laurent asked what she was supposed to do. The woman said, nothing. That was the point. That the custodians had never asked anyone to do anything except wait, and that waiting is not a moral achievement. It is just the only move on the board that has not yet been played. Then she said the last thing. She said that every historian who has ever vanished while researching Nostradamus, and there is a small but real list of them, people who abandoned careers, moved abroad, stopped publishing, went quiet in the middle of promising work, reached this same cellar, or one like it, and stood at this same table. None of them were silenced. Every one of them decided the secret has never been protected by force. It has been protected over and over by the specific and unbearable knowledge that you are the person holding it. Laurent went home. 11 months later, she published a paper. It is titled Compositional Sequencing in the Early Editions of Les Prophecies, a Reconstruction, and it runs to 81 pages, and it is the finest piece of textual scholarship in her field in 30 years. It presents the astronomical dating method. It presents the 19 edition comparison. It presents the corruption analysis, including the finding that the variants cluster in the astronomical verses at 8 times the background rate, which she attributes, in careful academic language, to the disproportionate difficulty of setting technical terminology in type. It has been cited 240 times. It says nothing about a cellar, nothing about a missing quatrain, nothing about a woman in a raincoat with a supermarket bag. She teaches. She supervises graduate students. She is, colleagues say, slightly quieter than she used to be, and she has developed an unnerving habit of asking people, in the middle of ordinary conversations, whether they have ever been absolutely certain of something they had no way of knowing. Most people say yes. Almost everyone has one. A dream that arrived a week early. A phone that rang exactly when you thought of it. A place you had never been that you could navigate in the dark. She does not tell them why she asks. And then, 18 months after the paper, a new edition of Les Prophecies appeared. It is a beautiful book. Cloth binding, sewn signatures, a facsimile of the 1555 title page, extensive notes, a scholarly apparatus, and a preface by a distinguished academic that carefully explains why the verses are not predictions and never were. It won a prize for design. It has sold extremely well. Laurent has a copy on her shelf, She has read it very carefully 3 times, the way she reads everything, comparing it against the editions she has spent her life with. And somewhere in that beautiful new book, in 3 of the verses that carry astronomical markers, 3 words are different. Not wrong exactly, defensible. Each one is a legitimate variant reading, each supported by at least 1 early printing, each the kind of editorial judgment that a good editor makes 40 times before breakfast. 3 words, enough to move 3 timestamps, enough to slide 3 verses out of position, and to take the chain that runs through the last section of the book, the section where the language sharpens and the coordinates begin, and break it in the middle. Anyone who reconstructs the sequence from this edition will get a document that reads almost right. It will chain beautifully for hundreds of verses. It will produce the same chronicle, the same wars, the same light brighter than the sun, the same net cast over the world. And then, near the end, it will drift, quietly and undetectably, into nonsense. They will not know. They will spend years assuming they made an error somewhere. Laurent noticed on the second reading. She put the book back on the shelf and did not tell anyone, and she has said since that she is not certain whether she was relieved or disappointed, and that she has decided the 2 feelings are closer together than she used to think. The sequence is broken again. The final prophecy is, once more, impossible to reconstruct. Until somebody, in 20 years or 100, notices that the verses are not in the right order, and starts counting planets, and begins the whole patient business over from the beginning. Which, according to the story, has already happened. Several times. So here is where we end up on this particular night in this particular version. The greatest misconception about Nostradamus was that he could see the future. According to the conspiracy, he could not. Nobody can. The future is not a place, and there is nothing there to look at. What he had was worse, and sadder, and much more human. He had a memory that did not fit inside the world he was living in. He had recollections of things that had not happened and would not happen, of cities he had never entered, and fires he had never stood near, and he had no framework at all for understanding what they were, because the framework would not exist for another 400 years. So he did what a person does with something they cannot carry. He wrote it down. He wrote it down for 30 years in an upstairs room by candlelight, in a house on a narrow street in a small town in Provence. An old man with swollen legs and a bowl of water, setting down everything he could remember of futures that had already been erased. And then, because he understood what it would do to us, he broke it into pieces and hid the pieces in plain sight, and left one piece out, and sealed it in an envelope, and wrote 6 words on the front for whoever found it first. History remembers him as a mysterious prophet whose verses seemed to predict what was coming. According to the conspiracy, his real secret was much stranger and much lonelier. The future had already happened. He was simply the only man who remembered enough of it to leave the rest of us a warning, and whether the warning was meant to be read or was only ever meant to be kept is a question that 460 years of quiet people have never managed to answer. Flight 370, the plane that vanished. Imagine boarding a plane for a routine overnight flight. You settle into your seat, close your eyes, and drift off as the engines hum beneath you. 6 hours later, you should wake up in Beijing. Instead, you wake up nowhere. You're simply gone, erased from the sky. No wreckage, no answers, no closure. This is not a thought experiment. This happened to 239 people on March 8th, 2014. And 10 years later, we still do not know why. The night everything changed. The air in Kuala Lumpur International Airport hung thick and humid on that March evening. Passengers filtered through the gate for Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, a red-eye service to Beijing Capital International Airport. Most were Chinese nationals heading home. Others were international travellers connecting through Beijing to destinations beyond. The Boeing 777 that would carry them sat gleaming under the airport lights. Registration number 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. Nearly £400,000 of aircraft, fuel, cargo and human life. Among the passengers was Philip Wood, an American executive working for IBM in Beijing. He had texted his partner before boarding, talking about plans for the summer, about maybe finally taking that vacation to Thailand they had been discussing. There was Wang Linshi, a 50-year-old calligraphy artist returning from an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur. His daughter was pregnant with his first grandchild. He carried a small carved wooden box in his carry-on, a gift he had spent weeks searching for. There were 23 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, engineers and technicians heading home after a week of technical training. They joked about the late departure time as they boarded, making plans to sleep through the flight. None of them knew they had approximately 1 hour and 38 minutes left to exist in the known world. At 12:41 in the morning local time, the wheels lifted off Malaysian soil. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old with 18,000 hours of flight experience, commanded the aircraft. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, sat beside him. Everything proceeded normally. The plane climbed into the darkness, turning northeast toward the South China Sea. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers reclined their seats. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering blankets and confirming seat belts. The cockpit was quiet. Routine. The autopilot system had already taken over the majority of flying tasks. The aircraft knew where it needed to go. All the pilots had to do was monitor, supervise and wait for Beijing to appear on the horizon in 5.5 hours. Air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur handed the flight off to Vietnamese airspace. At 1:19 in the morning, a voice from the cockpit transmitted the standard acknowledgement. Good night, Malaysian 37. 0. Routine words. Calm. Professional. Nothing to suggest what would happen next. 2 minutes later, at 1:21, the aircraft's transponder went silent. A transponder is not a luxury item. It is the voice that tells the world where you are, who you are, and how high you are flying. When it stops transmitting, the aircraft becomes a ghost. Controllers in Vietnam waited for Flight 370 to appear on their screens. It never did. They called Malaysian Air Traffic Control. Has the flight left your airspace? Yes, came the reply. It should be with you now. But it was not with anyone. For several minutes, controllers assumed it was a technical glitch. Transponders fail. Radios malfunction. It happens. They waited for the blip to reappear, for the pilots to call in with a problem report, for something normal to explain the absence. The minutes stretched. The silence deepened. And somewhere over the dark waters of the South China Sea, 239 people continued flying into oblivion. The turn. What happened next would become the foundation for every theory, every sleepless night, every conspiracy that followed. At 1:21, the moment the transponder died, the aircraft did not fall from the sky. It did not explode. It did not vanish into the ocean. Instead, it turned. A deliberate, calculated turn. Not the panicked maneuver of a pilot fighting for control, but the smooth banking arc of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The turn was precise. It occurred at the exact moment when responsibility for the aircraft was transferring between Malaysian and Vietnamese air traffic control. In that brief window, when neither controller was actively watching, the plane pivoted. It was the kind of timing that suggests either meticulous planning or extraordinary coincidence, and coincidences of that magnitude do not happen often in aviation. Military radar, which does not rely on transponders, tracked the aircraft as it reversed course. It flew back across the Malay Peninsula, threading through the border between Malaysian and Thai airspace. This corridor, the boundary between two countries, is monitored by both nations but actively controlled by neither. It is a seam in the radar coverage, a gap where an aircraft can fly without triggering immediate alerts. The plane followed this seam as though following a map. It passed directly over Malaysia at cruising altitude, over towns and cities where people slept, over the capital where government buildings sat dark and empty. No fighter jets scrambled to intercept, no alarm systems triggered. The aircraft was invisible to civilian radar and ignored by military systems that assumed it was an authorised flight. By 2:22 in the morning, it had travelled hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, heading northwest toward the Andaman Sea, and it was still flying. This was not a malfunction. This was a plan. The aircraft continued on this northwestern heading for approximately another hour. It flew over the Andaman Sea, that vast stretch of water between Thailand and India. Ships below saw nothing. Fishermen pulling nets in the darkness had no idea a commercial airliner was passing overhead. The plane was alone, cut off from communication, invisible to tracking systems, moving with purpose toward a destination no one could identify. Then, somewhere over the ocean, it turned again. This time, south. A long, sweeping arc that would take it away from all commercial flight paths, away from land, away from any place where people might notice. The Indian Ocean stretched before it, millions of square kilometres of empty water, and the aircraft pointed itself toward the void. At 8:11 that morning, nearly 7 hours after takeoff, a satellite owned by the British telecommunications company in Muscat registered a final automatic handshake with the aircraft. The plane's communication system, even with the transponder disabled, continued sending hourly pings to the satellite network. These pings did not contain location data, but engineers could analyse the signal to estimate distance and direction. The mathematics pointed to one conclusion. The aircraft had flown south, deep into the Indian Ocean, far beyond any possible landing site. Then silence, absolute and final. The search for ghosts. When dawn broke over the South China Sea on March 8th, families waiting at Beijing Airport knew something had gone wrong. Flight 370 had not arrived. It had not diverted. It had simply failed to exist. The arrival board showed the flight as delayed, then cancelled, then removed entirely. Airline representatives appeared, their faces carefully neutral, and began escorting family members to private rooms. They offered water, tissues, and apologies for the lack of information. They could not say where the plane was because they did not know. Vietnamese search and rescue teams scrambled aircraft and ships to scour the waters between Malaysia and Vietnam. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacons. The ocean surface remained pristine, as though the plane had never been there. They expanded the search area, thinking perhaps the aircraft had deviated slightly from its flight plan. They checked islands, coastlines, shallow waters where wreckage might be visible from the air. Nothing. For days, the search focused on the wrong ocean. Authorities assumed the aircraft had gone down somewhere near its intended flight path. It was a reasonable assumption. Planes do not turn around and fly backward. They do not disable their communication systems and navigate using military radar gaps. Ships crisscrossed the South China Sea. Aircraft flew grid patterns until their fuel tanks ran dry. International teams from China, Australia, Malaysia, and the United States poured resources into the effort. They were searching for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was the size of a small country and the needle was made of aluminum that sinks. The media descended. Reporters from every major news organisation converged on Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. They interviewed aviation experts, radar specialists and former pilots. Everyone had theories. Some suggested mechanical failure. Others pointed to terrorism. A few mentioned hijacking. But without wreckage, without bodies, without any physical evidence, every explanation was speculation dressed up as analysis. On March 24th, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak held a press conference. His face carried the weight of impossible news. Based on satellite analysis, he announced, Flight 370 had ended its journey in the southern Indian Ocean west of Perth, Australia. There were no survivors. The plane had flown for hours in the opposite direction of its destination before running out of fuel and plunging into one of the most remote stretches of water on Earth. The families in Beijing erupted. Some collapsed. Others screamed. A few attacked the airline representatives, demanding proof, demanding explanations, demanding that someone tell them how a plane could simply disappear in the age of satellites and GPS and global connectivity. The Malaysian government offered condolences. They promised a full investigation. They assured everyone that the truth would be found. But the truth was already drowning in miles of seawater, and no one knew where to look. The search shifted. Australian authorities coordinated the largest maritime search operation in history. Ships equipped with sophisticated sonar systems dragged towfish across the ocean floor, scanning an area that eventually exceeded 120,000 square kilometres. The technology was impressive. Side-scan sonar that could image the ocean bottom in stunning detail. Autonomous underwater vehicles that could dive deeper than any human and stay down for days. Magnetometers that detected metal from miles away. They mapped underwater mountains, discovered new marine species, and found shipwrecks that had been lost for centuries. But they did not find Flight 370. The search vessels operated in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The Indian Ocean is not gentle. Waves reached heights that dwarfed the ships. Storms rolled through with violence that shut down operations for days at a time. Crew members lived in cramped quarters, staring at sonar screens for hours, watching the ocean floor scroll past in grainy monochrome. Every anomaly triggered excitement. Every rock formation that looked slightly out of place became a potential lead. They would mark the coordinates, send down an underwater vehicle to investigate, and find nothing but geology and marine life. The operation cost more than $160 million. It involved multiple nations, dozens of ships, and thousands of personnel. It continued for nearly 3 years. In January of 2017, the search was officially suspended. The families of the missing were left with condolences and questions. The ocean had swallowed an entire aircraft and it was not giving it back. Fragments of proof. Then the ocean began to speak, one piece at a time. In July of 2015, Johnny Baig, a municipal worker on Reunion Island, was cleaning a beach on the eastern shore. It was routine work. Trash washed ashore constantly. Plastic bottles, fishing nets, debris from ships passing through the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. But this piece was different. It was large, maybe 6 feet long, covered in barnacles and algae. The metal underneath showed through in places, along with what looked like identifying numbers. Begay called the authorities. Within hours, aviation experts arrived. They photographed the object from every angle. They documented the barnacle growth, the corrosion patterns, the way the metal had torn. Then they loaded it onto a plane and flew it to France, where specialists at a facility outside Toulouse would examine it in a climate-controlled laboratory. It was a flaperon, part of the wing structure used to control the aircraft during landing. The serial numbers matched. It came from 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. It came from Flight 370. The discovery changed everything. It proved the aircraft had not been hidden on some remote island or secret military base. It had crashed. It had broken apart. And the currents of the Indian Ocean had been slowly distributing the wreckage for over a year. but the flaperon also raised questions. It showed evidence of high-speed impact, but not catastrophic destruction. The way it had separated from the wing suggested the aircraft had hit the water hard, but perhaps not as violently as a straight nosedive would produce. Some experts argued this indicated a controlled ditching attempt. Others said it proved nothing beyond the fact that the plane had crashed. Over the following months, more fragments appeared. A piece of wing washed ashore in Mozambique in February of 2016. Interior panelling from the cabin turned up on Madagascar a month later. A section of engine cowling arrived on the coast of Tanzania. Each fragment carried the signature marks of the missing Boeing 777. The Indian Ocean had been slowly digesting the wreckage for years, and now it was offering proof that the aircraft had indeed met its end in those waters. Beachcombers became amateur investigators. People walking coastlines across the Western Indian Ocean began looking for debris. They found fragments of composite material, pieces of what might have been seat components, scraps of metal that could have come from anywhere. The Malaysian government established protocols for reporting finds. Each piece was documented, photographed and analysed. Some were confirmed as coming from Flight 370. Others were from different aircraft, different accidents, different tragedies that the ocean had also claimed, but the fragments raised as many questions as they answered. Why only small pieces? Where was the main wreckage? Where were the flight data recorders, the black boxes that could explain everything? The pieces that had washed ashore represented less than 1% of the aircraft's total mass. A 777 weighs over 300,000 pounds empty. What had been recovered could fit in a cargo van. The rest remained hidden somewhere beneath miles of water. Ocean current experts studied the drift patterns. They built computer models simulating how debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, deep ocean circulation patterns, and the Coriolis effect. The model suggested that if debris had appeared on Reunion Island in July of 2015, the crash site must be farther north and east than the official search area. The plane might have come down closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered. The official conclusion: in July of 2018, the Malaysian government released its final report on the disappearance. The document ran to hundreds of pages. It contained radar data, satellite analysis, maintenance records, and biographical profiles of the crew. It examined the cargo manifest, passenger lists, and airport security footage. It included testimony from air traffic controllers, statements from family members, and technical assessments from aviation engineers. The conclusions were careful, measured, and ultimately unsatisfying. The aircraft had been manually diverted from its flight path by a person or persons unknown in the cockpit. The communication systems had been deliberately disabled. The transponder did not fail. Someone turned it off. The OCAR system, which transmits engine performance data, was also disabled. Someone went through the cockpit overhead panel and systematically shut down every system that would allow the outside world to track the aircraft. This required knowledge, access, and time. It was not the action of hijackers forcing their way into the cockpit. It was the methodical work of someone who belonged there. The plane had flown on for hours under human control before fuel exhaustion caused it to descend into the ocean. The final satellite handshake suggested the aircraft was in a rapid descent, possibly unpowered. Whether this descent was controlled or resulted from the aircraft simply falling out of the sky after running out of fuel could not be determined. Then came the admission that stripped away any sense of closure. The team is unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance, the report stated. We cannot exclude the possibility that there was unlawful interference by a third party. In other words, after 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the largest search in aviation history, the official answer was this: we do not know. Someone did something, and we cannot tell you who or why. It was an invitation for speculation, an open door through which every conspiracy theory, every alternative explanation, and every buried suspicion could walk. The captain and the flight simulator. Zahari Ahmad Shah had been flying for Malaysian Airlines since 1981. He was not a rookie, he was not erratic. Colleagues described him as professional, calm, and deeply knowledgeable. He had logged 18,000 flight hours, the kind of experience that turns piloting into muscle memory. He was a father, a husband, and an aviation enthusiast who built a full flight simulator in his home. The simulator was not a toy. It was a sophisticated setup using commercial software and professional-grade controls. He used it to practice approaches to difficult airports, to explore scenery, and to refine his skills. After the disappearance, Malaysian investigators seized the simulator. Forensic analysts recovered deleted files from the hard drive. What they found sent a chill through the investigation. Among the saved flight plans was a route that flew south into the Indian Ocean, continuing until fuel exhaustion. The flight path matched almost exactly the satellite data showing where the real aircraft had gone. The simulator data showed coordinates that aligned with the presumed crash site. The flight profile showed an aircraft flying for hours far beyond any normal route, until the fuel gauges read 0. It was as though someone had been planning, testing, rehearsing for the exact scenario that unfolded on March 8th. Had Zahari rehearsed his own suicide mission? The evidence seemed damning. He had the skill to disable every communication system on the aircraft. He had the knowledge to exploit radar gaps and international airspace boundaries. He knew the exact moment to turn off the transponder, the precise corridor to fly through to avoid detection, and the fuel calculations needed to reach the most remote part of the Indian Ocean. If anyone could make a 777 vanish, it was him. Investigators dug deeper into his personal life. They interviewed friends, family members, and colleagues. They examined his financial records, his political affiliations, and his social media activity. They found a man who seemed, by all accounts, content. His marriage had its problems, but what marriage does not after decades? His finances were stable. He was respected at work and liked by those who knew him. He had no terminal illness, no crushing debt, no scandal that would drive someone to desperate action. Some pointed to his support for Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who had been convicted of sodomy charges just hours before the flight departed. Zahari had attended political rallies. He had posted on social media about government corruption and judicial overreach. Could he have been so enraged by the verdict that he decided to make a political statement written in jet fuel and ocean water? The theory felt strained. Even if he opposed the government, why kill hundreds of innocent people? Why leave no message explaining his actions? Political protesters want attention. They want their grievances heard. A protest without a statement is not a protest. It is simply murder. And mass murder without explanation is the action of someone who has abandoned all connection to the human community. But there was another interpretation of the simulator data. Pilots run unusual scenarios all the time. They practice emergency procedures. They explore what-if situations. What if all engines failed over the ocean? What if communication systems went dead? What if you had to ditch in water? Running these scenarios in a simulator is precisely what a conscientious, skilled pilot would do. It is preparation, not planning. And the fact that one scenario happened to match the actual flight path could be coincidence. Or it could be proof. The investigation could not decide. They presented the evidence and left the conclusion ambiguous. Zahari remained Schrödinger's pilot, simultaneously innocent and guilty until someone opened the black box that would collapse the uncertainty into fact. But the black box was somewhere on the ocean floor and no one could find it. The ghost in the machine. The Boeing 777 is not just an aircraft. It is a flying computer network. Every system, from navigation to engine performance, feeds data through digital channels. The plane talks to the ground, to satellites, to its own internal components. It is monitored, measured, and managed by software. Hundreds of computers coordinate to keep the aircraft in the air. And where there are computers, there are vulnerabilities. In the years following 9/11, engineers developed concepts for remote flight recovery systems. The idea was simple and compelling. If hijackers took control of an aircraft, a signal from the ground could override the cockpit and fly the plane to safety. Passengers and crew would be protected. Hijackers would be neutralized. Terrorism in the sky would become impossible. Boeing filed patents for such technology. The concepts included encrypted communication links that could take control of flight systems, override manual inputs from the cockpit, and land the aircraft at a predetermined safe location. Honeywell explored similar systems. The goal was noble, but the implications were terrifying. If you can override a hijacker, you can override anyone. If you can remotely control a plane for good, you can remotely control it for anything. Conspiracy theorists latched onto this. What if Flight 370 was not diverted by the pilots, but by someone else? What if a cyber intrusion, a military override, or a classified program took control of the aircraft and flew it to a location the public was never meant to discover? The sudden loss of the transponder, the deliberate course change, the hours of silent flight through radar gaps all fit the profile of external interference. Think about the sequence of events. At 1:21 in the morning, multiple systems went dark simultaneously. The transponder stopped transmitting. The ACARS data link cut off. The radio went silent. For all of these systems to fail at once would require either catastrophic damage to the aircraft or deliberate action by someone with intimate knowledge of the plane's architecture. But there was no evidence of catastrophic damage. The plane kept flying. If someone in the cockpit was responsible, they would have needed to know exactly which circuit breakers to pull, which switches to flip, and which systems to disable in what order. They would have needed to do this while maintaining control of the aircraft, avoiding detection, and navigating through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. It is possible. Pilots train for emergencies that require quickly disabling systems, but the precision and timing suggest something more than emergency response. It suggests planning. But what if the actions came from outside the cockpit? What if someone accessed the aircraft's systems remotely and took control? The Boeing 777 does have data links that allow ground personnel to communicate with the aircraft's computers. These links are used for routine maintenance monitoring and software updates. They are encrypted and secured, but encryption can be broken and security can be bypassed. In the years since Flight 370 disappeared, security researchers have demonstrated vulnerabilities in aviation systems. They have shown how spoofing GPS signals can confuse navigation systems. They have hacked into in-flight entertainment networks and accessed deeper aircraft systems. They have proven that the digital architecture of modern aircraft, while sophisticated, is not impenetrable. The region through which Flight 370 flew is not empty airspace. It includes military zones monitored by multiple nations. Thailand operates radar installations that track everything moving through their airspace. India has air defense networks covering the Andaman Sea. The United States maintains signals intelligence facilities throughout the region. If the aircraft was hijacked remotely, those governments would have known. Their systems would have detected unusual communications, anomalous radar tracks or electronic signatures indicating a cyber operation. And if they knew, their silence becomes part of the cover-up. It transforms the disappearance from a tragedy into an act of war, or espionage, or some classified operation that cannot be acknowledged without exposing capabilities the public is not meant to know exist. But there is a problem. No evidence exists that remote override technology was ever installed on 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. The systems were theoretical, not operational. Boeing and Malaysian Airlines both confirmed that the aircraft lacked any such capability. Hacking into a plane mid-flight would require exploiting vulnerabilities that had never been demonstrated in a real-world scenario outside of controlled research environments. It is possible in the way that many things are technically possible, but that does not make it probable. Still, the theory persists because it answers the unanswerable. If human error or pilot suicide seems too simple, and if mechanical failure does not fit the facts, then external interference becomes the explanation that fills the void. It transforms a tragedy into a crime, and crimes have perpetrators. Crimes can be solved. Someone can be held accountable. The alternative, that chaos simply reached up and snatched 239 people out of existence, offers no one to blame and no path to justice. The island, no one admits exists. There is a place in the Indian Ocean that does not appear on most commercial maps. Diego Garcia, a coral atoll in the Chagos archipelago, leased by the British to the United States military. It hosts one of the most secretive and strategically important military installations on the planet. Long-range bombers operate from its runways. Nuclear submarines resupply at its docks. Intelligence operations launch from its secure facilities. Detainees captured in the War on Terror have been held there, far from lawyers and oversight, and it lies within fuel range of the last known position of Flight 370. The atoll is small, barely visible on most maps, but its strategic value is enormous. Diego Garcia sits at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean, positioned perfectly to project military power across Africa, the Middle East and South Asia. The base is so sensitive that even acknowledging operations there requires security clearances most military personnel will never obtain. What happens on Diego Garcia stays on Diego Garcia. Online researchers began connecting dots almost immediately after the disappearance. What if the aircraft did not crash? What if it was intercepted after entering restricted airspace and forced to land at Diego Garcia? The theory gained traction for several reasons. First, a controlled landing would explain the lack of debris in the initial search area. If the plane landed intact, there would be no wreckage floating in the South China Sea. The weeks of fruitless searching would make perfect sense. They were looking for something that had never crashed. Second, the US military had the capability to track and intercept an aircraft operating in that region. Diego Garcia has radar coverage extending for hundreds of miles. They would have seen Flight 370 coming. They would have known it was off course, unresponsive to radio calls, and heading toward restricted airspace. Standard protocols would require an intercept. Fighter jets would have been scrambled. The aircraft would have been visually identified, and if it entered the exclusion zone around Diego Garcia without authorization, the military would have options ranging from forced landing to shooting it down. Third, the base's extreme secrecy meant that any operation conducted there would remain hidden from public view. If the aircraft landed on Diego Garcia, the passengers could be detained indefinitely. The plane could be hidden in a hangar or dismantled, evidence could be controlled, and the official story could be whatever the governments involved decided it should be. Supporters of the theory pointed to anomalies. Some claim that satellite imagery from the night of the disappearance showed unusual activity at Diego Garcia. Commercial satellites do not typically photograph military bases, but some amateur satellite trackers reported that imaging satellites passed over the atoll around the time Flight 370 would have been in the area. The images were not released publicly, which conspiracy theorists took as confirmation that something was being hidden. Others noted that several passengers aboard the flight had connections to technology or defence industries. The Freescale semiconductor employees, for instance, worked on cutting-edge chip designs used in military applications. What if one of them was carrying sensitive information? What if the entire aircraft was intercepted to prevent that information from reaching China? It would be an extreme measure, but for information valuable enough, extreme measures might be justified. The theory gained further traction when a passenger aboard the flight, Philip Wood, allegedly sent a text message and photo after the plane disappeared. The metadata from the photo, according to claims circulating online, showed GPS coordinates placing it at Diego Garcia. The image itself was black, as though taken from inside a dark room or while the phone was concealed. The accompanying message claimed he had been drugged, was being held captive, and did not know where he was. Tech experts quickly debunked the claim. The metadata was fabricated. The message was a hoax. But the story spread faster than the debunking, and for many it became evidence of a cover-up, but the theory requires a conspiracy so vast it strains credibility. It would mean the United States, Malaysia, Australia, China and multiple other governments coordinated a cover-up involving thousands of personnel. Air traffic controllers, radar operators, satellite analysts, search and rescue teams, investigators and journalists would all need to be complicit or deceived. It would mean families grieving for their loved ones were lied to for years. It would mean wreckage was planted on beaches across the Indian Ocean to support a false narrative. And for what? To hide the capture of one aircraft? To conceal the detention of 239 people who would never be allowed to? Contact the outside world again? To protect information that could have been seized on the ground before the plane ever took off? The operational complexity and political risk of such a scheme far outweigh any conceivable benefit. The United States denied any involvement. The Malaysian government found no evidence supporting the theory. No whistleblowers emerged. No satellite photos confirmed the claims. Diego Garcia's logs, according to official statements, showed no record of Flight 370 ever approaching the base. And yet the theory endures because Diego Garcia represents the ultimate black box, a place where secrets go to hide, a location where the impossible becomes plausible simply because no one can prove otherwise. The cargo that should not have been there. Every flight carries baggage, freight and cargo that passengers never see. Flight 370 was no exception. The manifest listed 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries and 2.5 tons of electronics equipment shipped by Motorola. On the surface, this seems routine. Airlines transport batteries and electronics constantly. But the details raised questions. Lithium batteries are dangerous. They store energy in a volatile chemical form that can ignite under the right conditions. Overheating, physical damage, or manufacturing defects can trigger thermal runaway, a chain reaction where the battery heats itself to combustion. Once a lithium fire starts, it is nearly impossible to extinguish. Water does not work. Conventional fire extinguishers are ineffective. The fire burns until the chemical fuel is exhausted, releasing toxic gases and intense heat. Aviation regulators impose strict limits on how lithium batteries are packaged and transported. They must be individually protected, stored in fireproof containers, and limited in quantity per shipment. If the batteries on Flight 370 were improperly packed, they could have started a fire in the cargo hold. A fire could explain the sudden communication failures. Smoke and heat would incapacitate the crew. The aircraft on autopilot would continue flying until the fire consumed critical systems or the fuel ran out. Several fatal crashes have been caused by cargo fires. In 2010, UPS Airlines Flight 6 crashed in Dubai after a fire in the cargo hold filled the cockpit with smoke. The crew declared an emergency, but by the time they attempted to land, both pilots were incapacitated. The aircraft crashed short of the runway. Investigation revealed that lithium batteries in the cargo had ignited. Could the same thing have happened to Flight 370? The timeline seems to fit. The transponder went dark at 1:21. A fire could have been burning for several minutes before that, filling the cargo hold with smoke. The crew might have noticed warnings, declared an emergency to air traffic control, and then been cut off as the fire destroyed communication systems. The turn back toward Malaysia would make sense. They were trying to return to Kuala Lumpur for an emergency landing, but this theory has a fatal flaw. The satellite data proves the aircraft flew for nearly 7 hours after the transponder went dark. A cargo fire severe enough to disable communications would have destroyed the plane within minutes, not hours. The fire would have burned through control cables, hydraulic lines and structural components. The aircraft would have become uncontrollable and crashed in the South China Sea, not the Indian Ocean. And the deliberate course change, the precise navigation through radar gaps, suggests human intent, not a crew desperately fighting a fire. Other researchers focused on the nature of the cargo itself. What was Motorola shipping? The manifest listed the items as electronics, but provided no specifics. Customs documents showed weights that did not quite match the manifest. Some components were listed as radio equipment, others were described as accessories. The vagueness invited speculation. Some theorized that the cargo included sensitive technology or intelligence materials being transported to China. Semiconductor components, encrypted communications devices, prototypes of military hardware. If true, could a foreign power have intercepted the aircraft to seize the cargo? Could the plane have been shot down to prevent the technology from reaching its destination? These theories collapse under scrutiny. Shooting down a civilian airliner to stop a shipment of electronics is not how intelligence agencies operate. It is too public, too messy, and too risky. If a government wanted to intercept cargo, they would do it on the ground, at the airport, before the plane ever took off. Customs inspections, security screenings, and freight audits provide ample opportunity to examine cargo without resorting to aircraft interception. And even if someone did shoot down Flight 370, the debris would have been found. A missile strike leaves evidence. Wreckage does not fly 7 hours south and then gently scatter itself across the Indian Ocean. Missile fragments would be embedded in the debris. Chemical residues from the warhead would be detectable. Radar systems across multiple countries would have tracked the missile launch and impact. The cargo conspiracy persists because the manifest documents remain incomplete. Conflicting reports about weights and contents fuel suspicion. When governments cannot provide clear answers about what was on the plane, people assume they're hiding something, and perhaps they are. But the secret is more likely bureaucratic incompetence than international intrigue. Shipping manifests are often incomplete, especially for complex electronics. Customs forms are filled out by freight handlers who may not understand the technical specifications of what they are loading. Errors happen, discrepancies appear, and in the absence of malice never attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by ordinary human carelessness. The shadow plane. 4 months after Flight 370 disappeared, another Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 met a violent end. On July 17th, 2014, Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile fired from territory controlled by Russian-backed separatists. 298 people died. The aircraft disintegrated at cruising altitude, scattering wreckage across fields and villages in the war zone. Bodies fell from the sky. Debris rained down over an area covering several square kilometres. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Same airline, same aircraft type, similar flight numbers, both disasters occurring within months of each other. For conspiracy theorists, the coincidence was too perfect. They proposed something breathtaking in its audacity. What if Flight 370 never crashed? What if it was secretly moved, repainted with the registration number of Flight 17, and deliberately destroyed over Ukraine to escalate geopolitical tensions with Russia? The theory goes like this. Flight 370 was taken, either by interception or by pilot action, and flown to a secret location. The passengers were disposed of, the exact method left to imagination. The aircraft was stored in a hangar, repainted, and fitted with the registration number and markings of Flight 17. On July 17th, this substitute aircraft, already filled with corpses to match the passenger manifest, was flown into Ukrainian airspace along the route that Flight 17 should have taken. It was shot down by the missile, providing the West with evidence to blame Russia for killing civilians and justifying sanctions and military escalation. The motive, they argued, was to frame Russia for downing a civilian airliner, strengthening Western support for sanctions and military aid to Ukraine. The conflict had been simmering for months. Pro-Russian separatists controlled parts of eastern Ukraine. The West supported the Ukrainian government. A civilian massacre would shift public opinion, justify intervention, and provide a casus belli for deeper involvement. The theory captivated corners of the internet because it explained two mysteries with one conspiracy. It accounted for the lack of wreckage from Flight 370 and provided a false flag explanation for the downing of Flight 17. It transformed random tragedies into calculated acts of statecraft. It gave meaning to the senseless and imposed narrative order on chaos. But the theory collapses the moment you examine the evidence. Investigators recovered wreckage from Flight 17. They documented serial numbers on engines, structural components, and cockpit fragments. They traced manufacturer plates back to Boeing production records. Every piece confirmed the aircraft was indeed the plane that departed Amsterdam on July 17th, carrying 298 passengers and crew, not a substitute flown in from a hangar somewhere. The wreckage analysis was exhaustive. Independent investigators from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia and Ukraine participated. They recovered the cockpit, pieced together the fuselage sections, and examined the damage patterns. The aircraft showed evidence of high-energy fragmentation, consistent with proximity detonation of a surface-to-air missile warhead. Shrapnel had penetrated the airframe from outside. The damage was not staged, it was real. Moreover, the two aircraft had different maintenance histories, different configurations, and different equipment installed. Flight 370 was an older aircraft delivered in 2002. Flight 17 was newer, delivered in 1997. They had different interior layouts, different in-flight entertainment systems, different wear patterns from years of service. Swapping them would require replacing every component that carried identifying information. It would mean fooling airline staff who had worked on both planes, airport personnel who had serviced them, investigators from multiple nations who examined the wreckage, and the families of passengers who boarded Flight 17 in Amsterdam and could identify their loved ones from the remains recovered. The logistics alone make the theory impossible. You cannot secretly move a 777 without dozens of people noticing. Aircraft require maintenance crews, fuel trucks, tow vehicles, and flight plans. They leave paper trails, hangar records, surveillance footage, radio communications. Every step of moving an aircraft from one location to another generates documentation, and every person involved in such an operation becomes a potential whistleblower. And yet the theory persists because the human mind seeks patterns, even in chaos. Two Malaysian Airlines 777s meeting disaster within 4 months feels like it cannot be coincidence. The timing seems too perfect, the similarities too pronounced. But coincidences happen. Probability does not care about narrative symmetry. Sometimes the universe is just cruel. Sometimes tragedies cluster for no reason other than random chance and the sheer number of flights operating every day. The mathematics of silence in Marsat, the British satellite company, became an unlikely protagonist in the search for Flight 370. Their satellites provided the only real-time data showing where the aircraft had gone after disappearing from radar. The system was never designed for tracking planes. It was meant to handle routine communications between aircraft and ground stations, email services, internet connectivity, phone calls from passengers willing to pay premium rates. But engineers realised they could extract information from the signal itself. Every hour, the aircraft's communication system sent an automatic handshake to the satellite, a digital ping confirming the connection was active. Think of it as a heartbeat. The system checking in to say I'm still here. These pings did not contain GPS data. They did not include altitude, heading, or speed. They were simply electronic acknowledgements that the link between aircraft and satellite remained intact. But buried in these pings was information. Two crucial pieces of data that, combined, could reveal where the aircraft had been. First, the time it took for the signal to travel from the plane to the satellite revealed distance. Radio waves travel at the speed of the light, a constant. Measure the round-trip time of the signal, and you can calculate how far the aircraft was from the satellite. This gave engineers a circle. Somewhere on this circle, at this specific distance from the satellite, was Flight 370. Second, the frequency shift caused by the plane's movement revealed direction. This is the Doppler effect. The the same phenomenon that makes a siren sound different as it approaches or recedes. If the aircraft was moving toward the satellite, the radio signal would be compressed, increasing in frequency. If moving away, the signal would be stretched, decreasing in frequency. Measure this shift precisely enough and you can determine whether the aircraft was moving north or south along that circle. Analysts fed this data into computer models. They calculated possible flight paths. They cross-referenced fuel consumption rates, aircraft performance specifications, and wind patterns recorded on the night of the disappearance. They accounted for the weight of the aircraft, the efficiency of the engines at different altitudes, and the atmospheric conditions along various routes. The mathematics pointed south. The aircraft had flown into the Indian Ocean, beyond any hope of landing, until the fuel tanks ran dry and the engines flamed out. The final ping at 8:11 in the morning marked the moment the plane lost power. The satellite received a partial handshake and incomplete communication that suggested the aircraft's electrical systems were failing. This could mean the engines had stopped. Without engines, the generators that power the aircraft's systems would shut down. The plane would lose electrical power, communication systems would die, and the aircraft would begin its final descent. But here is where the physics became uncertain. How did the plane descend? If the pilots were unconscious or dead from hypoxia, the aircraft would have continued flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Then, without power, it would have entered a spiral dive, spinning faster and faster until it hit the ocean at terminal velocity. The impact would have been catastrophic. The aircraft would have shattered into thousands of pieces. The debris field would be small and deep, everything sinking quickly. But if someone was at the controls, if the descent was managed, the scenario changes. A skilled pilot could glide a 777 for significant distances without engine power. They could control the descent rate. They could choose the impact point, and they could attempt a controlled ditching, bringing the aircraft down on the ocean surface as gently as possible. A ditching does not guarantee survival. Water is not soft. At high speed, hitting water is like hitting concrete. But a skilled pilot might keep the aircraft more intact. The wreckage would be larger, easier to find. The debris recovered so far does not definitively answer which scenario occurred. The flaperon showed high impact damage, but not total destruction. Some interior panels were shattered, others were relatively intact. The evidence is contradictory, which means the descent could have been anything from a controlled ditching attempt to a spiralling plunge. Independent researchers confirmed the Inmarsat analysis. Experts like Richard Godfrey, a retired physicist with decades of experience in satellite communications, worked with publicly available data to verify the calculations. He reached the same conclusions. The plane had gone south. Victor Ianello, an engineer specializing in signal analysis, also examined the data independently. He found no errors in Inmarsat's work. The physics worked. The plane had flown into the Indian Ocean, but the ocean is vast, and the models could only narrow the search area to thousands of square kilometers. A margin of error measured in hundreds of miles meant the difference between finding wreckage and finding nothing. Small uncertainties in the aircraft's speed, heading, or altitude could shift the projected crash site significantly. If the plane had been flying slightly faster, it would have gone farther south. Slightly slower, and it would have come down farther north. The search teams were looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack covered an area larger than some countries, and no one was entirely sure which haystack. Critics argued that the Inmarsat data, while sophisticated, was not infallible. The calculations required assumptions. They assumed the aircraft had flown at constant altitude. They assumed no significant course changes after the final turn south. They assumed the engines performed within normal parameters. Any of these assumptions could be wrong. If the aircraft had climbed or descended, if it had turned east or west, if one engine had failed before the other, the calculations would produce incorrect results. Some ocean current experts noted that the debris recovered from beaches did not match the drift patterns expected if the plane had crashed in the official search zone. They built their own computer models, simulating how floating debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, seasonal variations, and the specific buoyancy characteristics of aircraft components. The model suggested the wreckage originated farther north and east, closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered, waiting for someone to look in the right place. In 2018, a private American company called Ocean Infinity launched a new search. They deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sophisticated sonar and mapping technology. Unlike earlier searches that used towed arrays, these drones operated independently. They could descend to extreme depths, navigate complex underwater terrain, and scan the ocean floor faster and more efficiently than any previous effort. Ocean Infinity's contract with the Malaysian government was unusual. They would be paid only if they found the wreckage. No find, no fee. It was a gamble, but the company believed their technology gave them an advantage. They covered thousands of square kilometres in months. They found shipwrecks, some from the age of sail. They mapped geological formations that had never been documented. They discovered underwater landscapes of stunning beauty and complexity, canyons and mountains and plains that had existed unseen since the ocean formed. But they did not find Flight 370. The contract expired. The search ended. The ocean kept its secret. Why we cannot let go. The human brain is not wired to accept uncertainty. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved to see cause and effect, to identify threats, and to make sense of our environment. We see faces in clouds. We find constellations in random arrangements of stars. We construct narratives from disconnected events because stories are how we understand the world. And when something as large and public as a commercial airliner vanishes, our minds demand an explanation proportional to the event. A mechanical failure feels too mundane. Planes are supposed to be safe. We trust them because they have redundancy, because they are maintained, because accidents are rare and usually explainable. The idea that a simple malfunction could erase 239 people does not match the scale of the tragedy. It feels insufficient. Pilot error feels too simple. Pilots are trained. They are vetted. They go through psychological evaluations and regular check rides. They fly millions of passengers safely every year. The idea that one pilot could deliberately murder hundreds of people clashes with everything we believe about the profession. It makes flying feel dangerous in a way we cannot control. So we want a story that matches the scale of the mystery. We want villains, motives, and hidden agendas. We want someone to blame who is not just a person but an institution, a government, a conspiracy large enough to feel worthy of the loss. Flight 370 offers all of that. The official narrative has gaps large enough to fly a 777 through. Why did the transponder go dark at the exact moment the plane was being handed off between air traffic controllers? The timing was perfect. Too perfect. If someone wanted to disappear a plane, this would be the moment to do it. The gap between controllers, the moment when no one is watching, when responsibility is transferring and everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. Why did the aircraft execute a perfect turn back over Malaysia, threading through radar coverage gaps? The flight path looks deliberate. It looks planned. It follows borders, exploits blind spots, and navigates with precision through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. This is not the wandering track of a doomed aircraft flying on autopilot. This is navigation. Why did no distress call ever come? Pilots are trained to communicate. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Even in emergencies, even when things are falling apart, you try to let someone know what is happening. Flight 370 went silent and stayed silent for 7 hours. That silence is the loudest mystery of all. These are not small questions. They are the foundation of doubt. And when official explanations cannot address them satisfactorily, people stop trusting the narrative. They start looking for alternatives. They start believing that maybe, just maybe, there is more to the story than governments are willing to admit. Governments made it worse. Malaysia withheld radar data for weeks. When they finally released it, the information contradicted earlier statements. They had known from the beginning that the plane had turned back. They had military radar tracks showing the aircraft crossing their country. But they did not share this information with search teams looking in the wrong ocean. Vietnam and Thailand admitted, only later, that their military systems had also tracked the aircraft but did not report it in real time. They saw a plane flying through their airspace without authorization, and they did nothing. No fighter jets scrambled, no alerts issued. The aircraft just flew through, and they watched it go. Australia led a search effort in an area that might have been entirely wrong. They committed ships, personnel, and millions of dollars based on satellite calculations that, while sophisticated, carried significant uncertainty. They found nothing, and then declared the search suspended. They left families with the message that their loved ones were out there somewhere, but not in a place worth continuing to look. China accused Malaysia of incompetence and cover-up. They demanded access to data. They sent their own ships and aircraft to search. They organised family groups and applied diplomatic pressure. But they also controlled the narrative within China, censoring online discussions and managing information flow to prevent panic or political embarrassment. The families of the missing were given conflicting information, false hope, and bureaucratic runarounds. They were told the plane had crashed, then told searchers were still looking for survivors. They were shown debris, then told it might not be from their loved one's aircraft. They were promised transparency, then given redacted reports and classified annexes they could not read. When authorities cannot agree on basic facts, the public stops trusting them. When governments withhold information, people assume the worst. When official explanations do not make sense, alternative theories fill the void. And those theories persist because in some cases they explain the evidence better than the official narrative. History teaches us that institutional deception is not paranoia, it is precedent. Governments have lied about downed airliners before. In 1988, the United States Navy cruiser Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing 290 people. The initial reports claimed the airliner was descending aggressively toward the ship and had been mistaken for a military aircraft. The Vincennes, operating in a combat zone, fired missiles in self-defense. It was a tragic accident, but understandable given the fog of war. Later investigations revealed the truth was more complicated. The airliner was climbing, not descending. It was transmitting civilian identification signals. It was in a recognised commercial air corridor. The crew of the Vincennes had made catastrophic errors in reading their radar systems, in communicating with each other, and in assessing the threat. And the US government had tried to obscure these errors, to present the incident as a reasonable mistake rather than negligence bordering on criminality. In 1983, Soviet fighters shot down Korean Airlines, Flight 007, after it strayed into restricted airspace near Sakhalin Island. 269 people died. The Soviet Union denied responsibility for days. They claimed they had not fired on the aircraft. Then they admitted they had fired but claimed the aircraft had been on a spy mission, deliberately violating Soviet airspace to gather intelligence. They presented radar tracks and radio intercepts that, they argued, proved the aircraft was not a civilian flight. Investigations eventually revealed it was a navigational error. The pilots had programmed the wrong coordinates into their autopilot. The aircraft had drifted hundreds of miles off course. Soviet air defense, operating under Cold War paranoia and assuming the worst, had shot first and investigated later. The truth took years to emerge, and only after political pressure forced both sides to release classified information. These cases prove that civilian airliners can be downed, that governments can lie, and that the truth can be buried under layers of national security and political expediency. When Flight 370 disappeared, these historical echoes shaped public perception. If it happened before, it could happen again. If they lied then, why? Believe them now. The Snowden revelations added fuel. After 2013, the world knew that intelligence agencies conducted mass surveillance, infiltrated communications networks, and operated with minimal oversight. The NSA collected phone records, emails, and internet traffic on a scale that would have seemed impossible before the leaks. They tapped undersea cables. They compromised encryption standards. They monitored foreign leaders, allies, and their own citizens. The idea that a classified program could remotely hijack an aircraft no longer seemed like science fiction. It seemed like Tuesday. If they can read your emails, if they can listen to your phone calls, if they can track your location in real time, why couldn't they take control of a plane? Trust in institutions eroded, and the void filled with suspicion. The ocean remembers. Stand on a beach in Madagascar and look east. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beneath miles of water, lies the answer to one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age. It is out there. The fuselage, the cockpit, the black boxes that recorded every word and every system failure in the final moments. It exists in the physical world, corroding slowly in salt water and silt, waiting for someone to find it. But the ocean is patient. It does not care about closure. It does not care about grieving families or public inquiries or conspiracy theories. It holds on to its secrets until it chooses to release them, piece by piece, in its own time. And the Indian Ocean is vast beyond comprehension, covering 70 million square kilometres with depths that reach 7,000 metres in some places. It is a realm where human technology is still primitive. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the ocean floor. The pressure at those depths is crushing. 700 times atmospheric pressure. Enough to collapse submarines not specifically designed to withstand it. Equipment fails. Electronics short out. Materials that seem strong on the surface become brittle and weak. The darkness is absolute. No sunlight penetrates beyond a few hundred meters. Everything below that exists in permanent night, a world where vision is useless and sound is king. The official narrative says Flight 370 ran out of fuel and spiraled into the water in a high-speed dive. The force of impact would have been enormous. Aluminum is strong, but not that strong. The fuselage would have crumpled on impact. Wings would have sheared off. The tail section would have separated. The force of hitting water at terminal velocity would have shattered the aircraft into thousands of fragments. The wreckage would have sunk quickly, tumbling through the water column until it settled on the ocean floor. Over time, currents would carry lighter pieces, the fragments that float, across the Indian Ocean. Seat cushions, insulation, plastic components. These would drift on the surface, carried by wind and waves, until eventually washing ashore on distant beaches. Some would drift for years. Ocean currents move slowly but relentlessly. A piece of debris released near Australia could take 18 months to reach Madagascar. The Indian Ocean gyre circulates clockwise, driven by trade winds and the Coriolis effect. Anything floating would eventually be caught in this current system and transported west, across thousands of kilometres of open ocean, until it reached the African coast or the islands scattered across the western Indian Ocean. But what if the descent was controlled? What if someone in the cockpit guided the plane down, ditching it as gently as physics allowed? A controlled water landing like the famous Hudson River event in 2009 keeps the aircraft more intact. Captain Sullenberger put that Airbus down on the river with such precision that the fuselage remained in one piece. Passengers evacuated onto the wings. Everyone survived. It was a miracle of skill and composure. But Hudson River was different. The river is calm. The aircraft was at low altitude and low speed. The conditions were ideal for ditching. The Indian Ocean is not calm. Waves reach heights that can swallow ships. The surface is constantly moving, rising and falling with swells that can be 12 feet high even on a good day. Touching down on moving water is like landing on a highway, where the pavement is jumping up and down. The timing has to be perfect. One wingtip hits a wave crest while the other is in a trough, and the aircraft cartwheels, disintegrating instantly. If Flight 370 attempted a controlled ditching, the pilot would have needed extraordinary skill and luck. Lower the landing gear to slow down, but not so much that the gear catches and rips off. Keep the wings level despite the waves. Touch down at the lowest possible speed while maintaining enough control authority to keep the nose up. Even if everything went perfectly, the aircraft would still have taken massive damage. The belly would have ruptured, water would have flooded in within seconds, the plane would sink in minutes. But it would sink slower than a high-speed crash. It would stay more recognisable. If Flight 370 went down that way, the wreckage would be larger, more concentrated, and potentially easier to find. The fuselage might have remained relatively intact, settling onto the ocean floor as a recognisable shape rather than scattered fragments. The black boxes, designed to survive impact and immersion, would still be attached to the tail section. They would still be broadcasting their locator pings, those ultrasonic signals that search equipment can detect from several kilometres away. Except the batteries in those locator beacons only last about 30 days. After that, they go silent. By the time search teams arrived in the right general area, the beacons had stopped transmitting. The wreckage became just another feature of the ocean floor, indistinguishable from rock formations or coral, structures, or the countless other objects resting in the deep. The fragments recovered so far suggest violent structural failure. The flaperon showed damage consistent with high-speed impact. The edges were torn, not cut. The composite materials had shattered rather than bending. Interior panels were shattered. The honeycomb structure collapsed by force. But without the main wreckage, without the black boxes, the evidence is incomplete. We are trying to reconstruct a crime scene with less than 1% of the puzzle pieces. A controlled ditching also means something more disturbing. It means consciousness, decision-making, and intent. It means whoever was at the controls was still there at the end, still flying the plane, still making choices. It means they guided the aircraft to the most remote part of the ocean deliberately, ensuring that even if the wreckage was found, it would take years or decades. It means they wanted the plane to disappear. The families left behind, 239 people boarded Flight 370. They carried passports, phones, wallets, photographs and plans. Some were travelling for business, some were going home, some were starting vacations. They had families who expected to hear from them after landing, parents waiting for calls, children expecting their mum or dad to return, spouses holding on to boarding passes and text messages, the last scraps of communication before silence. Philip Wood was supposed to meet his partner Sarah Beige in Beijing. They had been planning to move in together. He had sent her a message before boarding, something casual, something about seeing her soon. That message became the last record of his voice. Sarah spent years searching for answers, attending press conferences, confronting Malaysian officials, and refusing to accept that he was simply gone without explanation. The families of the Freescale Semiconductor employees faced a different kind of grief. Their loved ones had been travelling as a group, colleagues and friends who worked together daily. The families knew each other. They had attended company picnics and holiday parties. Now they gathered not for celebration but for memorial services. They created support networks, sharing information and theories, trying to find meaning in a tragedy that offered none. The Chinese families who made up the majority of passengers organised themselves into advocacy groups. They held protests outside the Malaysian embassy in Beijing, demanding transparency and accountability. They hired lawyers to sue the airline. They crowdfunded independent investigations. Some believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded the government treat the disappearance as a criminal case, not a simple crash. When the plane did not arrive, those families entered a kind of purgatory. Their loved ones were not confirmed dead because no bodies were recovered, but they were not alive because the plane had vanished. Grief without closure is a special kind of torment. It does not allow you to move on because there is always the possibility, however small, that the official story is wrong, that somewhere, somehow, the person you lost might still exist. Death is final. Death brings pain, but it also brings certainty. You can mourn. You can bury the body. You can begin the slow process of healing. But when someone disappears, when they simply cease to exist without evidence, the mind cannot close the door. It keeps the possibility alive. Maybe they survived the crash. Maybe they are on an island somewhere. Maybe the plane landed and they are being held captive. These thoughts are irrational, but grief is not rational. The Chinese government organised support groups for the families of Chinese passengers. They held memorials, provided counselling, and pressured Malaysian authorities for answers. But they also controlled the narrative within China. Online discussions about the disappearance were monitored and sometimes censored. Conspiracy theories that blamed the Chinese government or suggested the passengers were still alive were removed. The state wanted grief to be orderly, contained, and directed toward Malaysia, not toward Beijing. Some families accused Malaysia of criminal negligence. The delayed response, the contradictory statements, the withheld radar data all suggested incompetence at best and cover-up at worst. They demanded criminal charges against air traffic controllers, against Malaysian Airlines executives, against anyone who might be held responsible for what they saw as preventable deaths. Others believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded investigations, transparency, and accountability. What they received were press conferences, reports, and platitudes. Officials spoke in carefully rehearsed sentences. They expressed sympathy. They promised continued efforts. But they offered no answers, no bodies, and no justice. Conspiracy theories, for the families, were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were lifelines. If the plane had been taken, their loved ones might still be alive. If there was a cover-up, there might be justice. The alternative, that random catastrophe had simply erased the people they loved, offered nothing to hold on to, and so they clung to possibilities, no matter how unlikely, because the human heart needs hope, even when hope is irrational. 10 years later, some families still search. They organise independent investigations. They crowdfund search efforts. They analyse ocean currents and drift models. They correspond with retired aviation experts and amateur researchers. They refuse to accept that the answer is we do not know and never will. Because for them, the missing are not a cold case. They are parents, children, friends, and partners who deserve to be found. Grace Nathan lost her mother on Flight 370. She has spent the decade since becoming an advocate for families of the missing. She attends conferences. She speaks to journalists. She pressures governments to continue searching. She has become an expert in satellite analysis, ocean current modelling, and aviation investigation procedures. She did not choose this expertise. It was forced upon her by the refusal of authorities to provide answers. She learned because no one else would do it for her. There are dozens like her. Family members who transformed grief into action, who refused to be placated by official statements, who learned the technical details of aircraft systems and search methodologies because they needed to understand what happened. They are amateur investigators driven by love and loss. And they will not stop searching because stopping means accepting that their loved ones are gone forever, without explanation. The final accounting. On March 8th, 2014, at 12:41 in the morning, a Boeing 777 departed Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. At 8:11 that morning, it sent its last signal to a satellite. In the hours between, someone or something redirected the aircraft, disabled its communication systems, and flew it into one of the most remote parts of the planet. The official investigation concluded that manual intervention was responsible, but could not identify who or why. The search for wreckage became the most expensive in aviation history and found almost nothing. The families of the missing were left without answers, without bodies, and without closure. The conspiracy theories emerged because the gaps in the official story were too large to ignore. Every alternative explanation, from pilot suicide to remote hijacking to military interception, attempted to impose logic on the void. Some theories were plausible, others were absurd, but all of them shared a common origin: the refusal to accept that the world's most advanced aviation infrastructure could lose an aircraft and never recover it. What we know is this: Flight 3. 70 flew for nearly 7 hours after disappearing from civilian radar. It crossed Malaysia, turned northwest, then south. It flew over open ocean until fuel exhaustion. Debris confirmed to be from the aircraft washed ashore across the western Indian Ocean. The satellite data proves the plane went south. The fragments prove it crashed. The plane is gone. The people are gone. The answers are still out there, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting. What we do not know is why. We do not know who made the decision to turn the plane around. We do not know if it was one person or many. We do not know if it was planned or impulsive, political or personal, malicious or desperate. We do not know if the passengers died quickly from hypoxia or spent hours terrified in the dark. We do not know if the cockpit was locked, if there was a struggle, if anyone tried to stop what was happening. We do not know because the ocean does not give up its secrets easily. The search officially ended in January of 2017. The case remains open. The families still grieve. The wreckage still lies somewhere in the dark, untouched and undiscovered. And the theories persist because mysteries this profound do not die. They evolve, adapt, and take on new life with each unanswered question. Flight 3. 70 vanished, but its ghost remains, in the forums where researchers argue over satellite data, in the dreams of families who lost someone that night, in the warnings issued by aviation authorities who now know that a plane can simply disappear, and the world may never find it. The ocean holds the truth, and it is not ready to let go. Some mysteries are solved with evidence and investigation. Others are solved only with time, when the ocean finally erodes the wreckage enough for it to surface, or when someone stumbles across the debris field by accident. And some mysteries are never solved at all. They remain open wounds in the historical record, questions without answers, tragedies without closure. Flight 3. 70 is all of those things. It is a disappearance that defies explanation, a disaster that left no wreckage in the place anyone expected to find it, a crime scene with no crime that can be proven, a ghost story written in satellite data and ocean currents, and it remains, 10 years later, the plane that the world could not find and cannot forget. The sea knows what happened. The sea watched it fall, but the sea does not speak, and we are left with silence, fragments, and the terrible knowledge that 239 people left the ground and never returned. The only certainty is this: somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean, in water too deep and too dark for light to reach, the answer still waits. It has been waiting for 10 years. It will wait for as many more as it takes, because the ocean is patient, and the truth, however buried, does not cease to exist. It simply remains unfound.